Welcome to the story of electricity. For most of human history, we've watched the sky with awe and terror, seen lightning split the darkness, felt thunder shake our bones. We wondered, what is this force? Where does it come from? Can we ever understand it? And then, slowly, across centuries of curiosity and courage, we began to answer those questions. We learned not just to understand electricity, but to create it, to harness it, to make it serve our purposes. And in doing so, we discovered something even more profound, that electricity flows through our own bodies, that it might be the very spark of consciousness itself. This is the story of how humanity discovered, conquered, and became electrified. It's a journey from ancient wonder to quantum mystery, from gods in the sky to thoughts in our minds. So settle in. This is a story that will reshape how you see the world around you and within you. The first witnesses. Picture yourself standing with ancient humans on a hillside, thousands of years before writing was invented, before civilization had a name. The day is hot. The sky is clear. But something shifts. The air grows heavy, charged with a strange tension you can almost taste. A breeze stirs. Clouds begin to gather like dark thoughts. Then, without warning, the sky tears open. A brilliant white lightning bolt zigzags across the heavens, violent, terrifying, incomprehensibly bright. The sound comes next, a crack so loud it feels like the world is breaking apart. Thunder rolls across the landscape, shaking the earth beneath your feet, vibrating in your chest. Your heart races. Your ancestors around you cry out, some falling to their knees. A tree nearby erupts into flames. A person struck by the lightning falls motionless. They were alive moments before. Now they are gone. For millennia, this will be humanity's relationship with lightning. It is not understood. It is feared. It is sacred. It is deadly. It is a mystery that defines our sense of helplessness before nature's raw power. Electric spirits. Different cultures around the world watched the sky and created stories to make sense of what they saw. In the ancient Mediterranean, the Greeks observed amber, a fossilized tree resin that washed ashore from the Baltic Sea. When they rubbed amber with cloth, something extraordinary happened. The amber would attract light fibers, bits of straw, feathers. It was as if the stone had come alive, as if an invisible force emanated from it. They named this power. They called it electron. The word meant amber, but it also came to mean something more, the invisible force itself. Meanwhile, in Scandinavia, the Norse people looked at the sky and imagined Thor, the god of thunder, riding his chariot across the clouds, his hammer Mjolnir crashing down to create lightning and thunder. In Africa, cultures spoke of Oya, the powerful Orisha of storms, wild and untamable, a force of transformation and chaos. In China, people saw the dragon, a creature of power and mystery, commanding both water and lightning. Every culture independently recognized that lightning was something momentous, something divine, something that demanded respect and reverence. They didn't know what it was, but they knew it mattered. The thunder gods fall. But something began to shift during the Renaissance and the Age of Reason. Philosophers started asking dangerous questions. What if lightning wasn't divine punishment? What if thunder wasn't a god's voice? What if these were natural phenomena, subject to natural laws, waiting to be understood? This was heresy. This was challenging the very foundations of religious authority. Yet the questions persisted. Curious minds began to observe more carefully. They noticed patterns. Lightning seemed to strike tall objects more often than short ones. It appeared to travel along certain paths. It seemed to prefer metals. Could these be clues? Could a natural force be predicted, understood, even controlled? The idea was radical. The idea was dangerous. But the idea was irresistible. Slowly, the thunder gods began to fade from serious inquiry. Not from human hearts. People still feared storms, still felt the numinous power, but from the realm of scientific explanation. Lightning would no longer be attributed to divine will. It would be pursued as a mystery waiting to be solved by human reason. A question ignites. Around 600 years before the birth of Christ, in the ancient Greek city of Miletus, there lived a merchant and philosopher named Thales. He traveled widely. He saw different lands, different peoples, different ways of understanding the world. And he asked questions. One particular question consumed him. What is the fundamental nature of all things? What is reality made of? This question, this almost absurd, audacious question, marks the true beginning of Western science. Not because Thales answered it correctly, but because he asked it at all, because he believed the world could be understood through observation and reason, rather than mythology and faith. And in pursuing this question, Thales made an observation that would echo through the centuries. He rubbed amber against wool. He watched as light fibers clung to it. He had created something that shouldn't exist, an invisible force, a power that acted without contact, without explanation. He called the phenomenon electron after the amber itself. He didn't understand it, but he documented it, he observed it, he made it real. And in doing so, he planted a seed that would grow for 2,000 years. The amber experiment. Imagine Thales in his study, perhaps at evening, with candlelight casting shadows on the walls. He holds a piece of amber, smooth and warm from being polished. The amber is a golden color, beautiful in itself, but it's what he can do with it that fascinates him. He reaches for a piece of wool cloth, coarse and rough. Slowly, deliberately, he rubs the amber against the wool. Back and forth, back and forth. He feels the warmth building. The friction creates heat. But something else is happening too. When he brings the amber close to a pile of dried plant fibers scattered on a table, something impossible occurs. The fibers leap toward the amber. They don't fall toward it from above. They don't roll toward it across the surface. They jump, defying gravity, clinging to the amber as if magnetized. Thales lifts the amber and the fibers cling stubbornly, suspended in air. He moves the amber away, and they drop. He repeats the experiment again and again. Each time, the same result. Each time, the mystery deepens. What force is this? Why does rubbing create it? Why does it only work with amber? Or does it work with other materials too? Thales didn't know the answers, but he had discovered something real, something reproducible, something that demanded explanation. He had created the first documented electrical experiment in human history. Rubbed into existence. For nearly 2,000 years after Thales, electricity remained a curiosity, a parlor trick, something to demonstrate to amuse friends at gatherings. Merchants who handled amber found that it attracted lightweight objects when rubbed. A few scholars mentioned it in their writings, but it sparked little serious investigation. It was seen as an oddity, not as a window into nature's deepest workings. Then came the Renaissance, that great awakening of human curiosity and investigation. Scholars began to systematically study the phenomenon that Thales had observed. They experimented. They tested different materials. They discovered that amber wasn't alone. Sealing wax, when rubbed, produced the same effect. Glass did too. Sulfur, even diamond when polished. Whatever force amber possessed, it seemed to be more widespread than anyone had realized. A Spanish physician named Juan Martinez noticed something curious. When he rubbed glass with cloth and held it near another piece of rubbed glass, something unexpected happened. They repelled each other. They pushed away. But a rubbed glass rod attracted a rubbed piece of amber. Attraction and repulsion. Two opposite forces. The phenomenon was becoming more complex, more intriguing. The power that Thales had stumbled upon was not a single force, but perhaps two, or perhaps one force with different modes of expression. Gilbert's Great Leap. In the year 1593, there was a man named William Gilbert living in England. He was a physician to the Queen, a scientist, and a systematic thinker. He decided to devote himself entirely to understanding this mysterious rubbing phenomenon. He called it electricity, building on Thales's word electron. It was not a casual pursuit. Gilbert was methodical. He conducted hundreds of experiments. He rubbed materials carefully. He tested which substances possessed the property and which did not. He investigated whether the effect changed with temperature or humidity. He documented everything. And through this painstaking work, Gilbert made a crucial discovery. Electricity, he realized, was fundamentally different from magnetism. People had long known about magnetism. Lodestones attracted iron, compasses pointed north. But magnetism worked without friction. You didn't need to rub a lodestone to make it magnetic. Yet with electricity, rubbing was essential. Gilbert tested dozens of materials and created the first systematic taxonomy of electrical substances. He proved that the effect was reproducible, that it followed rules, that it was not magic, but nature. His book, De Magne, published in 1594, became the foundational text. It established electricity as a legitimate subject of scientific inquiry. For the first time, someone had treated the invisible force not as a curiosity, but as a phenomenon worthy of serious study. He had given it a name. He had given it dignity. He had transformed it from an oddity into a science. The Leyden Jar Moment. But there was a problem. Whatever this electrical force was, it couldn't be stored. Rub glass with cloth and you create the effect. Set the glass down and within moments the effect dissipates. The invisible force evaporates. Electricity was fugitive, fleeting. You could create it, but you couldn't hold it. Not until 1752, when something extraordinary happened in the Dutch city of Leyden. A physicist named Peter van Musschenbroek was experimenting with electricity, rubbing glass rods, creating the familiar effects. He had an idea. What if he could trap the electricity inside something? What if he could make it accumulate? So he connected a rubbed glass rod to a metal rod suspended inside a glass jar filled with water. The water, he theorized, might capture and hold the electrical force. When he pulled the rod out of the jar, something remarkable occurred. The electrical charge remained in the jar. The electricity hadn't dissipated. It was trapped, contained, stored. When he touched the metal rod again, he received a shock, a sudden jolt that made him cry out and jump backward. The stored electricity had discharged through his body. He had been struck by his own creation, held in a simple jar. Word of this discovery spread like wildfire through the scientific community. The Leyden jar, as it came to be called, was revolutionary. Now, electricity could be captured. Now, it could be accumulated. Now, it could be studied in a way that was never before possible. Scientists began making larger jars, stronger devices. They could store more electricity, create more powerful effects. The invisible force was becoming visible in its consequences. It was becoming tangible. It was becoming powerful. The invisible fluid theory. With the Leyden jar, electricity moved from curiosity to power. But scientists still didn't understand what it was. What was this invisible substance that could be rubbed into existence, stored in a jar, and discharged through a human body? The theories varied. Some thought electricity was a type of fire. Others imagined it as a fluid, an invisible liquid that could flow from one place to another, pooling in some materials and draining from others. In 1749, a brilliant American scientist and statesman named Benjamin Franklin proposed an elegant theory. What if electricity was a single fluid, he asked, and all electrical phenomena were the result of having either too much of this fluid or too little? Franklin called it the electric fluid. Objects with an excess of electric fluid, he said, had positive electrical charge. Objects with a deficit had negative electrical charge. When you rubbed glass with silk, you transferred the electric fluid, creating an imbalance. Opposite charges attracted because they wanted to balance. Like charges repelled because they pushed against each other. It was a beautiful theory. It was intuitive. It explained many observed phenomena. It gave scientists a framework for thinking about electricity. And it was wrong. Not entirely wrong. The concept of positive and negative charges was profound and useful, but the underlying assumption was incorrect. Electricity wasn't a fluid at all. It was something far stranger, something that wouldn't be fully understood until the 20th century, when physicists peered into the atom itself and discovered the electron. But Franklin's fluid theory was so elegant, so useful, that it dominated scientific thinking for over a century. Sometimes the wrong answer, if it's useful enough, can advance science as much as the right one. Kite in a storm. Benjamin Franklin was not content to theorize. He wanted to test. He wanted to know whether the electricity that people created by rubbing glass was the same force that thundered across the sky as lightning. The hypothesis was wild. If it were true, it would mean that lightning was not divine, not beyond human understanding, but a natural phenomenon, perhaps even something that could be controlled. In June of 1752, Franklin designed an experiment. During a thunderstorm, he would fly a kite into the storm clouds. The kite would have a sharp pointed rod extending upward. A damp string would connect the kite to a metal key held in Franklin's hands. If lightning struck the kite, the electrical charge would travel down the string, through the key, and Franklin could observe it. It was an insane experiment. Lightning kills. Franklin knew this, but he also believed in the truth strongly enough to risk his life for it. He stood under a shelter to protect himself from the rain, holding the string as the storm raged. Other people watched from a distance, certain they were witnessing a suicide. But then something miraculous happened. The sky flashed, the storm intensified, and Franklin felt a tingling in his hand. When he brought his finger near the metal key, tiny sparks jumped from the key to his finger. The electricity that had fallen from the sky was now in his hand. It was the same force. Lightning and rubbed glass produced the same phenomenon. Electricity was not divided into sacred and mundane categories. It was all one force. The implications were staggering. If lightning was electricity, then lightning was natural. It followed laws. It could be understood. Perhaps it could even be controlled. Franklin's experiment didn't prove everything, and it nearly killed him. But it opened a door. It suggested that the universe operated according to natural principles, not divine whim. It suggested that understanding nature could give humans power over nature, and in doing so, it marked a turning point in human history. The birth of conduction. After Franklin's experiment confirmed that lightning was electricity, a new question emerged. How does electricity travel? How does the charge move from one place to another? Some materials seem to conduct electricity readily. Metals, for instance. When you created a charge in a metal rod and connected it to a Leyden jar, the electricity flowed easily, completely, almost eagerly. But other materials seem to resist. Glass wouldn't conduct electricity well. Neither would silk or rubber. These materials seem to block the flow, to insulate against it. Scientists began to classify materials as conductors and insulators. Copper was an excellent conductor. Silver was even better. But glass was nearly a perfect insulator. This distinction would prove crucial, because if electricity could be made to flow through conductors, then perhaps it could be directed, channeled, made to follow specific paths. Perhaps it could be made useful. A scientist named Georg Simon Ohm discovered a profound relationship. He found that the amount of electrical current flowing through a conductor depended on three things: the strength of the electrical force pushing the current, the resistance of the material, and the amount of current that could flow. He expressed this as a simple equation, which we now call Ohm's law. Resistance equals voltage divided by current. It was a beautiful relationship, a fundamental truth of electricity that would help govern all electrical engineering forever. But more than the equation itself, Ohm's work revealed a profound insight. Electricity behaved like a fluid. It could be forced through narrower passages if you pushed hard enough. It would take the path of least resistance. It could be controlled and predicted. Copper wires became the arteries of electrical systems. And with this understanding, humans had the knowledge they needed to harness electricity not as a curiosity, but as a power source. The stage was being set for a revolution. The accidental discovery. It is the autumn of 1780 in the Italian city of Bologna. A physician and physicist named Luigi Galvani is in his laboratory, conducting electrical experiments with Leyden jars, studying how electricity affects living tissue. His wife, Lucia, is assisting him. On a nearby table lie dissected frogs, freshly killed specimens prepared for anatomical study. Galvani has connected one of the frogs to his electrical apparatus. He's curious about whether electricity affects muscle tissue. As he performs the experiment, something extraordinary happens. One of the frog's legs twitches. It's a small movement, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. The dead frog's leg moved. Galvani's heart races. He tries again. Another twitch, and another. The frog is dead. There is no blood flowing. There is no will driving the movement. Yet the electricity causes the muscle to contract, to animate, to move as if the frog were alive. Lucia notices something else. On particularly humid days, when frogs are hung from brass hooks attached to iron railings outside the laboratory, their legs twitch spontaneously, without any electrical apparatus at all. Just hanging there in the moisture and the metal, they twitch. Galvani becomes obsessed. He performs hundreds of experiments. He uses different metals, different positions, different conditions, and always the same result: electricity makes dead muscle move. It animates the inanimate. It is as if electricity is the essence of life itself, the vital spark that separates the living from the dead. When machines mimic life. Imagine the profound, unsettling feeling that must have possessed Galvani as he watched the dead frog's leg kick and spasm. For centuries, humans had drawn a clear line between the living and the dead. The living moved. The dead did not. It was the fundamental distinction. But here was electricity, a mere force, capable of making dead flesh move exactly as if it were alive. What did this mean? Was electricity the essence of life? Was life itself just electrical? Was there truly a difference between a living muscle and a dead one, if electricity could make the dead one behave identically to the living? These questions haunted him. Galvani began to wonder whether the electrical fluid that Franklin had theorized might not be some abstract force, but the actual principle of animation in living things. Perhaps every living creature was fundamentally electrical. Perhaps the nerves that controlled muscles were electrical conduits. Perhaps the very act of thought, of sensation, of will was electrical in nature. He wrote extensively about his discoveries, publishing his findings in 1791 in a work called De Viribus Electricitatis in Motu Musculari Commentarius, a treatise on the powers of electricity in muscular motion. The title was cautious, but his implications were revolutionary. He proposed that every animal possessed a natural electrical force, what he called animal electricity. Life and electricity might not be separate phenomena. They might be one and the same. The scientific world erupted. Some researchers were skeptical. How could electricity be the principle of life when electricity was just one more force, indifferent and mechanical? But others were captivated. If Galvani was right, then consciousness itself might be electrical. The soul might be a measurable phenomenon. Death might be the absence of electrical flow. The implications for religion, for philosophy, for the very understanding of human existence were staggering. The Volta Responds, but not everyone was convinced. Among the skeptics was a physicist named Alessandro Volta, working in the nearby city of Como. Volta was brilliant, meticulous, and suspicious of grand claims. He repeated Galvani's experiments and confirmed that the phenomena were real. Dead frogs did indeed twitch when subjected to electricity. But Volta disagreed with Galvani's interpretation. Volta proposed an alternative explanation. What if the electricity wasn't coming from inside the frog at all? What if it was being created by the interaction of the different metals that Galvani was using in his experiments? When you connected a brass hook to an iron railing through a conducting frog, you were creating a specific electrical condition. The frog's body was simply acting as a conductor, transmitting electricity that was being generated by the chemical reaction between the two metals and the frog's tissue itself. The electricity wasn't animal electricity, it was chemical electricity. It was being manufactured, not discovered. Volta conducted brilliant experiments to prove his point. He created a device consisting of alternating discs of copper and zinc separated by cloth soaked in salt water. When he connected the two ends, electricity flowed. He had created electricity without any animal tissue at all, using only metals and salt water. He called his device the Volta pile, and it was revolutionary. Here was a way to create electrical current continuously, not through friction or rubbing, but through chemical reaction. Volta had not just disagreed with Galvani. He had fundamentally advanced the field. He had shown that electricity could be manufactured, could be sustained, could be generated on demand. The implications were staggering. If you could create electricity chemically, then you might be able to create as much as you wanted. You might be able to power devices. You might be able to illuminate cities. You might be able to transform human civilization, creating continuous current. The Volta pile was crude by modern standards, but it represented a watershed moment in human history. For the first time, humanity possessed a reliable source of sustained electrical current. No more depending on friction, on rubbing, on Leyden jars that would discharge in seconds. With a Volta pile, you could have electricity flowing continuously as long as you wanted it. Scientists immediately began to improve on Volta's design. They stacked more disks, creating stronger currents. They experimented with different metal combinations and salt solutions. The designs became more sophisticated. By 1800, scientists had created what we now call the voltaic cell, a single unit capable of producing electrical current through chemical reaction. Multiple cells could be connected together in what we call a battery, a term that comes from military artillery, the idea of multiple units firing together. Each cell was small, but together they could generate substantial electrical power. With this breakthrough, the whole character of electrical research changed. Now scientists could study electricity not as a rare phenomenon or a parlor trick, but as a reliable, controllable force. They could design experiments that would have been impossible before. They could power devices. They could sustain electrical arcs. They could heat wires until they glowed red. They could create electromagnetic effects that persisted for hours or days. The world of pure research in electricity opened up. But more than that, the way was now clear for practical applications. If electricity could be produced reliably and sustainably, then it could eventually be harnessed for human use. The seeds of the electrical age had been planted. It would take another century for them to bloom fully, but the possibility was now undeniable. Electricity was not just a curiosity. It was a power source waiting to be tapped. The chemical secret. What was happening inside the Volta pile? Why did different metals combined with salt water produce electrical current? The answer lay in chemistry, in the hidden dance of atoms and molecules that wouldn't be fully understood for decades. When you placed a zinc disk and a copper disk in a salt water solution, something remarkable occurred at the molecular level. The zinc, being more chemically reactive than copper, had a tendency to lose electrons. The copper had a tendency to accept them, but the salt water prevented the electrons from flowing directly from zinc to copper. Instead, a separation of charge developed. The zinc became negatively charged, the copper positively charged. When you connected the two metals with a wire, which could conduct electrons, the electrons flowed from the zinc through the wire to the copper, driven by the chemical imbalance. This flow of electrical current, and as long as the chemical reaction continued, as long as the zinc kept losing electrons and the copper kept accepting them, the current would flow. It was elegant. It was invisible. But it was also the key to unlocking electrical power on a massive scale. Because if chemical reactions could produce electrical current, then any chemical reaction strong enough could potentially be harnessed. As long as the chemical reaction continued, electricity would keep flowing. The relationship between chemistry and electricity was profound. They were not separate domains of science. They were intimately connected. Chemical energy could be transformed into electrical energy. And, as scientists would later discover, electrical energy could drive chemical reactions. They were two faces of the same underlying reality. This insight would ripple through science for centuries, eventually revolutionizing everything from medicine to industrial manufacturing to the devices we hold in our hands today. A new power awakens. By the year 1805, Volta had been honored by the Emperor Napoleon himself. His pile had spread throughout Europe. Scientists everywhere were conducting experiments with this new, reliable source of electrical power. And the implications were becoming clear. If you could sustain electrical current indefinitely, you could use it to do work. You could heat wires until they glowed. You could create chemical reactions in solutions, breaking down compounds into their constituent elements. You could create magnetic fields. You could transmit signals over wires. The age of static electricity, of rubbed amber and Leyden jars, was ending. The age of dynamic electricity, of flowing current, was beginning. Humanity had moved from wondering about lightning in the sky to creating lightning in the laboratory. They had moved from being passive observers of electrical phenomena to being active creators of it. This shift was not purely scientific. It was psychological. It was philosophical. For most of human history, the great forces of nature, lightning, fire, wind, water, had been beyond human control. They were forces we endured, we feared, we worshipped. Now, suddenly, one of the greatest forces was being tamed. It was being created. It was being commanded by human will. The implications rippled outward. If electricity could be created and controlled, what else might be controllable? What other forces of nature might yield to human understanding and manipulation? The Enlightenment had given humanity intellectual tools. The Volta pile gave humanity the first taste of power over the forces that ruled the world. It was intoxicating. It was terrifying. It was, in many ways, the beginning of the modern age. The age when nature would no longer be something humanity endured, but something humanity could transform. Oersted's revelation. The year is 1820. A physicist named Hans Christian Oersted is in his laboratory in Copenhagen, conducting an experiment that would have seemed impossible just decades before. He has a Volta pile creating a sustained electrical current through a wire. He has a compass, a simple magnetic needle suspended so it can rotate freely. He brings the compass near the electrical wire. According to everything that scientists thought they knew, nothing should happen. Electricity and magnetism were different forces. They were separate phenomena. But as Oersted brings the compass close to the wire carrying electrical current, something extraordinary happens. The compass needle moves. It rotates. It points not toward magnetic north, but toward the wire itself. When he turns the wire, the compass needle follows, always perpendicular to the direction of the current. When he reverses the current, the compass needle reverses direction. The connection is unmistakable. Electricity creates magnetism. The two forces that scientists had believed were fundamentally separate are revealed to be intimately connected, perhaps even different manifestations of the same underlying phenomenon. Oersted repeats the experiment again and again, each time with the same result. He publishes his findings, and the scientific world is electrified, quite literally. This is not a small discovery. This is a revelation that electricity and magnetism are unified, that they are aspects of a single force. The implications would take decades to fully develop, but the door had been opened. Nature was far more unified than anyone had imagined. Faraday's field of dreams. Michael Faraday was an unusual scientist. He had no formal education, no university training, no social connections to the scientific establishment. He was a bookbinder's apprentice who taught himself science through obsessive reading and self-directed experimentation. But he possessed something more valuable than credentials, an imagination that could visualize nature in ways that other scientists could not. When Faraday learned of Oersted's discovery, he was struck by a particular question. If electricity creates magnetism, then could magnetism create electricity? It seemed elegant. It seemed symmetrical. It seemed like the kind of truth nature might encode in her workings. So Faraday designed an experiment. He would create a changing magnetic field and see if it generated electricity. He took an iron ring and wrapped two coils of wire around it. One coil was connected to a Volta pile, creating a current through the coil and therefore a magnetic field through the iron. The other coil was connected to a galvanometer, a sensitive device for detecting electrical current. When he turned the current on in the first coil, the magnetic field through the iron changed. And in that moment of change, the second coil detected a brief pulse of electrical current. He had done it. Magnetism created electricity. The relationship was reciprocal. But more than that, Faraday had made an observation that would reshape physics. It wasn't the steady magnetic field that created electricity. It was the change in the magnetic field. A moving magnet created an electrical current. A changing magnetic field induced electricity. This principle of electromagnetic induction would become the foundation of electrical engineering. Every generator, every transformer, every electrical device that converts mechanical energy into electrical energy relies on this principle. But beyond the practical applications, Faraday had revealed something profound about nature. He proposed that space around a magnet wasn't empty. It was filled with what he called lines of force, invisible fields extending outward from the magnet. And when these lines of force moved or changed, they induced electrical currents. Space itself, Faraday suggested, was not empty. It was alive with fields, with forces, with invisible connections. It was a radical idea, more philosophical than strictly mathematical, but it would prove prescient. He couldn't prove it rigorously with the mathematics of his time, but his intuition was leading him toward a truth about the nature of reality itself. Induction and transformation. Faraday's principle of electromagnetic induction opened a floodgate of possibilities. If a moving magnet created electricity, then you could design a device that rotated a magnet around a coil of wire and generate electricity continuously. You had a generator, a machine that converted mechanical motion into electrical current. Conversely, if you already had electrical current, you could create a moving magnetic field, which could push magnets, which could create mechanical motion. You had an electric motor. These weren't just theoretical possibilities. Scientists and engineers immediately began building them. By the middle of the 1800s, electric generators and motors were being constructed and improved. A generator required a source of mechanical energy, water falling over a dam, steam pushing a turbine, a hand crank turned by human effort. But the beauty of the system was that the mechanical energy could be converted into electrical energy, and then the electrical energy could be transmitted over wires to power motors or lights elsewhere. You could generate electricity in one place and use it in another. You could store it in batteries. You could control and direct it with switches. The implications for industry were staggering. Factories didn't have to locate themselves on rivers to use water power. They could locate anywhere there was a source of mechanical energy to generate electricity. The electricity could power all the machines in the factory with far greater efficiency than the direct mechanical transmission that factories had previously relied on. The age of mechanical shafts and belts connecting motors to machinery was ending. The age of electrical power distribution was beginning, and it would transform everything. Maxwell's equations. By the middle of the 1800s, scientists had accumulated a wealth of empirical knowledge about electricity and magnetism. But the knowledge was scattered, sometimes contradictory, lacking in deep understanding. There was no unified theory tying it all together. Then came a Scottish physicist named James Clerk Maxwell. Maxwell was a genius of mathematical physics, capable of expressing the observations of experimental scientists in elegant mathematical language. He took all the known phenomena, Oersted's discovery that electricity creates magnetism, Faraday's discovery of electromagnetic induction, Coulomb's law governing electric forces, and many others, and synthesized them into a unified framework. The result was 4 equations. Just 4 equations, relatively simple in form, yet containing within them the entire structure of electromagnetism. These became known as Maxwell's equations. They described how electric fields arise from charges and how magnetic fields arise from currents. They showed how changing electric fields create magnetic fields and how changing magnetic fields create electric fields. They revealed a deep symmetry and unity underlying all electrical and magnetic phenomena. But Maxwell went further. He solved his equations mathematically and discovered something astonishing. The equations implied that electromagnetic disturbances should propagate through space as waves, traveling at a specific speed. He calculated that speed, and it matched, precisely, the speed of light. Light was an electromagnetic wave. The visible light that had illuminated human civilization for all of history was not some separate phenomenon. It was electricity and magnetism oscillating through space. Maxwell had unified electricity, magnetism, and light into a single theoretical framework. It was one of the greatest intellectual achievements in the history of science. And it was profound not just in its content, but in what it revealed about the method of science. Maxwell had shown that diverse phenomena could be unified through mathematics, that nature possessed deep symmetries and connections that might not be immediately obvious from observation alone, that there was an elegance and simplicity underlying the apparent complexity of the world. The implications would ripple through science for centuries. But immediately, scientists realized that if light was electromagnetic radiation, then there might be other forms of electromagnetic radiation that humans couldn't see. There might be invisible light, waves beyond the visible spectrum. And if they could create electromagnetic waves at will, they could transmit signals through the air itself, without wires, over any distance. The foundations of wireless communication were laid in Maxwell's 4 equations. Light revealed. When Maxwell proposed that light was electromagnetic radiation, it was not immediately accepted. How could the light from the sun be the same phenomenon as electricity flowing through a wire? They seemed entirely different. But in 1888, a German physicist named Heinrich Hertz conducted an elegant experiment that proved Maxwell right. Using a circuit that created oscillating electrical current, Hertz generated electromagnetic waves at a frequency far too high and wavelength far too short to be visible light. But he constructed a simple receiver, a wire loop with a small gap in it. When the electromagnetic waves struck the loop, they induced a current in it, and the current jumped across the gap, creating a tiny spark. He had transmitted waves through empty air and detected them at a distance. The waves traveled at the speed of light. They behaved like light in every way that could be measured, but they were invisible to the human eye. They were, in every meaningful sense, invisible light. Hertz's experiment was a triumph for Maxwell's theory. It proved that light was indeed electromagnetic radiation. It demonstrated that electromagnetic waves of any frequency could be generated, transmitted, and received. It opened the door to wireless communication. Within years, Guglielmo Marconi would take Hertz's discovery and develop practical radio transmission. Messages could be transmitted through the air itself. Voices and music could be captured, converted to electrical signals, broadcast as electromagnetic waves, and received and converted back to sound in receivers miles away. The implications were revolutionary. Humanity had gained a new sense, a new way of perceiving and communicating across distances previously impossible to bridge. And all of it flowed from Maxwell's insight that light was electricity and magnetism dancing through the void. The universe was far more unified, far more elegant than anyone had imagined. Electricity, magnetism, light, radio, they were all manifestations of a single underlying phenomenon. Nature was simpler than it appeared, yet infinitely more profound. Edison's empire. By the 1870s, electricity had moved from laboratory curiosity to commercial possibility. The question was not whether electricity would transform civilization, but how. And that question ignited one of the most bitter, vicious, and consequential rivalries in the history of technology. Thomas Alva Edison was a man of extraordinary drive and almost no formal education. He taught himself through reading and experimentation. He had already invented the phonograph, the device that could record and replay sound, a marvel that had made him famous and wealthy. But he wanted more. He wanted to light the world. Edison had a vision of electrical systems that were simple, controllable, and profitable. His plan centered on direct current, DC, the same kind of current that batteries produced. Steady, consistent, flowing in one direction. Edison designed a complete electrical system. At the center would be a central generating station, powered by steam engines turning generators. From this station, copper wires would be buried underground, carrying direct current through the city. Homes and businesses would connect to these wires and receive electricity on demand. It was an elegant vision, and Edison had the business acumen to make it happen. He founded the Edison Electric Light Company. He secured patents. He built demonstration systems. He cultivated relationships with wealthy investors and politicians. He made the case that his DC system was safe, reliable, and would bring electric light to every home and business. And for several years, it worked. Edison's direct current systems were built in cities across America. Arc lights, incredibly bright, powered by electricity, began to replace gas lamps in streets. In homes, incandescent bulbs powered by Edison's DC system glowed with a warm, controllable light that was infinitely superior to gas or candles. People loved it. Investors loved it. Edison became a celebrity, almost a national treasure. He seemed to represent American innovation, American can-do spirit, American mastery over nature. But there was a problem with direct current systems. They couldn't transmit electricity very far. The resistance of the copper wires meant that electrical energy was lost as heat as it traveled from the generating station to distant customers. If you wanted to power a city with direct current, you needed generating stations scattered throughout the city, each serving only a small area nearby. It was expensive. It was inefficient. It was not a system that could scale to power a nation or a world. And there was someone watching Edison's success very carefully, someone with a different vision of the future. The dangers below. While Edison's DC systems were being built, there were accidents, electrocutions. A woman touched a live wire and fell dead. A man working on electrical lines was shocked and burned. A child playing with an exposed wire was killed. These deaths alarmed the public. They also alarmed Edison's competitors. Edison responded to the accidents by arguing that his DC current was actually quite safe at the voltages he used. The real danger, he claimed, was not his system, but the alternative systems that others were proposing. There was a current being promoted by others, alternating current, or AC. AC was different from DC. Instead of flowing in one direction at constant voltage, AC oscillated, flowing back and forth, changing direction many times per second. Edison seized on this difference. He began a campaign, orchestrated, deliberate, devastating, to discredit alternating current. He funded experiments in which he used AC to electrocute animals, dogs, cattle, a horse. He filmed the executions and showed the films to journalists and investors. He wrote articles describing the dangers of AC current. He lobbied politicians to restrict AC use. He even proposed that executions of criminals be carried out using AC current, which eventually happened. The first person executed by electrocution in America in 1890 was killed using alternating current. Edison hoped that associating AC with death would make the public fear it. He used the term Westinghoused to describe death by AC, in reference to George Westinghouse, the businessman backing AC technology. It was a campaign of fear and propaganda unprecedented in its scope and malevolence, and it very nearly succeeded. For a time, it seemed that Edison's vision would dominate, that direct current would be the future of electrical power. But Edison had underestimated both the physics of the situation and the determination of those who believed in a different path. Tesla arrives. In 1884, a young man named Nikola Tesla arrived in New York from Eastern Europe. Tesla was a genius of extraordinary stature, a visionary who could imagine systems of stunning complexity and elegance. He had studied electrical engineering in Europe, and he had become convinced that alternating current was the key to the future. Unlike Edison, who was a practical businessman and tinkerer, Tesla was a dreamer and a theorist. He could envision complete electrical systems in his mind, imagining the flow of electricity through networks of wires, understanding how transformers could convert high voltage to low voltage, how AC could be transmitted over long distances with minimal loss. When Tesla arrived in America, he sought out Edison. Perhaps they could work together. Tesla had ideas, Edison had resources and business connections. But the meeting was a disaster. Edison dismissed Tesla's visions as impractical. AC was dangerous, Edison insisted. DC was the future. Tesla left Edison's employment deeply disillusioned. But he was undeterred. He began working on perfecting AC motors and generators. By 1887, he had designed an AC motor of extraordinary elegance and efficiency. It had no brushes, no commutators, no moving electrical contacts. It was simple, it was reliable. It was far superior to the DC motors that Edison was promoting. Tesla filed patents. He demonstrated his motor to engineers and investors. Word began to spread that there was a superior technology, that alternating current might indeed be the future. George Westinghouse, an industrialist and engineer, heard about Tesla's work. Westinghouse was a man of vision and resources. He understood that Tesla had created something revolutionary. He purchased the rights to Tesla's patents and hired Tesla to work with him in developing complete AC electrical systems. Now there was a powerful competitor to Edison. Now there was a genuine alternative vision of how the electrical future would unfold. The stage was set for a conflict that would reshape the world. The War of Currents begins. The years from 1887 to 1893 became known as the War of Currents. Edison fought with every tool at his disposal. He funded anti-AC propaganda. He worked with politicians to pass laws restricting AC use. He continued his campaign of demonstrating deaths caused by AC. He used his reputation and his wealth to convince people that AC was dangerous, that Edison's DC system was the only safe choice. Westinghouse and Tesla responded with demonstrations of their own. They showed that AC, properly handled, was as safe as DC. They demonstrated the superiority of AC transmission. Electricity could be transmitted over hundreds of miles with AC, suffering minimal loss, whereas DC could only be transmitted a few miles before the resistance in the wires dissipated too much energy. They proved that AC motors were more efficient and more reliable than DC motors. The argument was fundamentally about physics and economics, but Edison fought it as a battle for public opinion and regulatory power. At one point, Edison funded the development of the electric chair and ensured that it used AC current, both to execute criminals and to make AC current synonymous with death. It was calculated cruelty on a massive scale. But physics and economics are powerful forces. As time went on, it became clear that AC was superior for large-scale power distribution. You could generate AC electricity at a power station, use a transformer to convert it to very high voltage, transmit it over long distances with minimal loss, then use another transformer to convert it back to lower voltages for use in homes and businesses. With DC, no such transformation was possible. You were stuck with the voltage you generated at, and you could transmit it only a short distance. The mathematics and physics of the situation were inexorable. AC was simply better. Slowly, inevitably, the electric utilities began switching to AC systems. Westinghouse won major contracts. Edison's DC systems, once dominant, began to be phased out. By the 1890s, it was clear that alternating current had won. Edison continued to promote DC for decades, refusing to concede defeat, but the battle was over. AC had triumphed because it was more efficient, more practical, more suitable for large-scale power distribution. The war of currents was Edison's first and most significant business defeat. But for the world, it was a victory of physics over propaganda, of the superior technology over the politically connected one. Niagara Falls changes everything. The deciding moment came in 1893 at Niagara Falls. There was enormous water power there. Water falling over the massive falls could drive turbines connected to electrical generators. The question was, what kind of generators? What kind of system would be built? Edison, using all his political influence, lobbied to have the Niagara Falls Power Company, the utility that would be built there, use his direct current system. It would have been the largest electrical system in the world, powered by the most dramatic natural feature in North America. It would have validated his vision and perhaps secured DC as the standard for American electricity. But Westinghouse and Tesla won the contract. Imagine the moment when George Westinghouse stood at Niagara Falls and authorized the construction of an alternating current power station. Two massive AC generators, each capable of producing 10,000 kilowatts of electrical power, were installed. Water flowing over the falls turned turbines. The turbines drove the generators. The generators produced alternating current at 685 volts. The electricity was stepped up to multiple thousands of volts using transformers. This high-voltage electricity was transmitted over wires spanning over 30 miles to Buffalo, New York. In Buffalo, transformers stepped the voltage back down for use in homes and businesses and powering electric motors in factories. The system worked flawlessly. Electricity was being generated at one of the most powerful natural sites in North America and transmitted successfully over 30 miles. It proved beyond any doubt that alternating current was the future. The Niagara Falls Power Station became the most famous electrical installation in the world. Engineers traveled from across the globe to study it. Utilities everywhere began building AC systems. Within a decade, AC had become the standard for electrical power distribution across the United States and soon across the world. Thomas Edison had lost. Not because his technology was bad, direct current systems worked fine for local applications, but because alternating current was better suited for the kind of large-scale power distribution that the modern world required. The implications were staggering. With AC transmission, electricity could be generated at a few massive power stations and distributed across entire regions. Power could be generated wherever the resources existed: waterfalls, coal fields, eventually oil fields. The electricity could travel wherever it was needed. The age of centralized electrical power had begun, and with it, the modern world as we know it was born. A new power awakens. By the turn of the 20th century, it was clear that electricity would transform human civilization in ways that barely anyone had anticipated. Niagara Falls had been harnessed. Dams were being built on rivers across America. Coal-fired power plants were under construction. Electricity was flowing through transmission lines across vast distances. Cities were being rewired with AC electrical systems. Factories were being retrofitted with electric motors. The age of mechanical power, of shafts and belts driven by steam engines or water wheels, was ending. The age of electrical power was beginning, and with electrical power came possibilities that seemed limitless. Electricity could light the darkness. It could power machines with unprecedented efficiency and control. It could be transmitted invisibly through wires. It could be stored in batteries. It could be converted to heat, to motion, to light. With electricity, the old limitations of human civilization were beginning to dissolve. Work that had once required enormous physical effort could now be accomplished by machines. Darkness that had limited human activity to daylight hours and candlelight could now be banished by electric light. Communication across distances that had once required days of travel or the speed of a fast horse could now be instantaneous. Electricity was not just a technology. It was a liberation. It was a new power that humanity had discovered and learned to harness, and the implications were only beginning to unfold. No one in 1895 could have imagined the world that electricity would create in the century to come. But everyone sensed that something fundamental had changed. The modern age had dawned, and electricity was its essential element. From flame to filament. For all of human history, light came from fire. From the flames of burning wood to the flames of candles to the flames of gas lamps, humans have relied on chemical combustion to produce light. But in 1879, Thomas Edison perfected something that scientists had been experimenting with for decades: the incandescent light bulb. It was not a new invention. Numerous scientists had experimented with passing electric current through filaments that would glow. But Edison was not primarily a scientist. He was an engineer and a businessman. He understood what scientists did not, that the key to making the light bulb practical was not the bulb itself, but the entire electrical system that would power it. Edison created a complete system. He designed generators to produce the electricity. He designed wiring systems to distribute it. He designed sockets and fixtures for the bulbs. He designed switches and controls. He even designed the bulb itself, a carbon filament in a vacuum that would glow brilliantly when electrical current passed through it, producing light far more efficiently than gas lamps and lasting far longer than candles. But the most important thing Edison did was understand the economics. He made the incandescent bulb affordable. He made the electrical systems affordable. He made it economically viable for ordinary people to use electric light in their homes. The incandescent bulb was not revolutionary because it was new. It was revolutionary because Edison made it practical and affordable. And once it was practical and affordable, it transformed human life in ways both obvious and profound. Electric light separated night from day in a way that candlelight and gaslight never could. A room lit by electric bulbs was not dim and flickering. It was bright, steady, controllable. You could flip a switch and have light. You could flip it again and have darkness. For the first time in human history, night became optional. You could choose to be awake and active at times that would once have been dark and quiet. Night becomes optional. Consider what this means. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans lived according to the rhythm of the sun. We were active during daylight. We rested at night. Our bodies, our minds, our entire civilization were organized around this fundamental rhythm. Cities quieted at night. Work ceased. Commerce paused. Life slowed. Then came candles and gas lamps, which helped a little, but they were dim and expensive. Only the wealthy could afford to light their homes at night. Then came electric light. Suddenly, night was not obligatory darkness. It was optional. If you had electricity, you could have bright light at any hour. You could work at night. You could socialize at night. You could be fully active and productive at any time. Factories could operate around the clock. Shifts became possible. Work that had once been constrained to daylight hours could now continue through the night. Cities became different places. Streets that had once been dark and dangerous were now illuminated. Crime changed. Social patterns changed. Human behavior changed. People began to sleep less. Work became more continuous. The boundary between day and night, which had ruled human civilization since the beginning, began to blur. And with it, so many aspects of human life shifted. Electricity didn't just power machines. It reshaped the rhythm of human existence itself. It changed when we work, when we rest, when we socialize, when we are active, and when we sleep. The effects rippled through every aspect of society. In factories, productivity increased because machines could run longer. In cities, crime decreased because more light meant more visibility. In homes, the quality of life improved as people could read and work and spend time with family by bright, steady electric light rather than dim, flickering candlelight. And culturally, the night lost some of its mystery and some of its danger. The darkness that had haunted human imagination for millennia became optional. We had conquered the night itself with electricity. The psychological implications were subtle but profound. Humans had gained power over one of the most fundamental forces governing our existence. And in doing so, we had begun to reshape ourselves. The Telegraph Connects. While Edison was perfecting the incandescent bulb, others were using electricity for a different purpose: communication. In 1837, Samuel Morse, working with others, developed the telegraph. The telegraph was a remarkably simple device conceptually. At one end, a person would use a switch to send pulses of electrical current down a wire. At the other end, an electromagnet would receive those pulses. Each pulse would cause the electromagnet to pull a lever, which would press a stylus against a moving strip of paper, creating a mark. Long pulses and short pulses created a code, dots and dashes, that represented letters and numbers. The telegraph transformed communication. Before the telegraph, messages could only travel as fast as a person could carry them. A message from New York to San Francisco required days or weeks. The telegraph made that same journey instantaneous. You could send a message across the country in seconds. You could send it across the Atlantic through submarine cables. Communication was no longer constrained by the speed of travel. It was constrained only by the speed of electricity, which was essentially the speed of light. The telegraph was revolutionary, not because it was technically complex. It was simple, but because it did something that had never been done before. It conveyed information over vast distances instantaneously. It made distance irrelevant for the purposes of communication. And with the telegraph came new possibilities. News could be transmitted instantly. Business transactions could happen between people separated by hundreds of miles. Trains could be coordinated using telegraph messages. The telegraph tied the nation together. It made the vast spaces of the United States feel smaller, and it demonstrated something profound: that electricity was not just a power source for machines and light. It was a medium for carrying information. It could carry messages. It could carry human intent and human knowledge across any distance. Marconi's invisible waves. But the telegraph had a limitation. You needed wires. You needed physical cables connecting the transmitter to the receiver. What if you could send signals through the air itself, without wires? This was the question that fascinated a young Italian inventor named Guglielmo Marconi. Marconi knew about Heinrich Hertz's experiments creating invisible electromagnetic waves. He reasoned that if Hertz could create these waves and detect them in a laboratory, perhaps he could transmit them over longer distances and use them to send telegraph signals. In the 1890s, Marconi began experimenting. He created a transmitter that sent electrical pulses through an antenna, radiating them as electromagnetic waves into the air. He created a receiver that had an antenna to capture the waves and a detector to sense them. He began with short distances, a few hundred feet, then gradually increased the distance. In 1895, he transmitted a wireless signal over a distance of over a mile. The impossible had become reality. Messages could be sent through the air without wires. Distance was no longer a limitation. By 1900, Marconi had transmitted signals across the English Channel. By 1901, he had transmitted across the Atlantic Ocean. The wireless telegraph was born. Ships could communicate with shore without needing cable connections. Communications could happen across oceans, across continents, wirelessly. Information could travel through the air itself. The implications were staggering. If electrical signals could travel through the air as radio waves, then voices and music could potentially do the same. If you could encode sound as electrical pulses and broadcast them as radio waves, receivers could convert those waves back into sound. Radio, the transmission of voice and music through the air, became theoretically possible. And within a few years, inventors and engineers were making it practical. The radio dreams. In 1904, a man named John Ambrose Fleming developed the thermionic valve, a device that could detect radio waves and amplify them. This made wireless receivers much more practical and sensitive. Then, in 1906, Lee de Forest invented an improved version called the triode valve. With the triode, you could amplify radio signals dramatically. You could take a weak radio signal and amplify it to full strength. And more importantly, you could use the triode to generate and control radio waves. You could modulate radio waves with sound, encode voice or music in the frequency or amplitude of the waves. A receiver could demodulate those waves and recover the original sound. Radio became practical. In 1906, on Christmas Eve, Reginald Fessenden broadcast music and voice over radio from Massachusetts. People listening on receivers for the first time heard a human voice and music coming out of the air with no wires, no visible connection. It seemed like magic. It seemed impossible. But it was real. Radio transmission had arrived. Within a decade, radio stations were broadcasting regularly. People in homes had radio receivers. They could dial different frequencies and hear voices and music from distant cities. They could hear news, music, drama, comedy. They could hear live events unfolding thousands of miles away as they happened. Radio transcended distance. It made information and entertainment available to anyone with a receiver. And it demonstrated the power of electromagnetic waves in a way that captured the public imagination. Wireless transmission, signals traveling through the air invisibly at the speed of light, carrying information and entertainment, became a defining technology of the modern age. People began to imagine what else might be possible. If voice and music could be transmitted wirelessly, what else could be sent through the air? What other impossibilities might be made possible? Cities transformed. By the 1920s, electricity had completely transformed urban landscapes. Streets were illuminated by electric streetlights, bright and steady. Homes were lit by electric bulbs. Businesses displayed electric signs advertising their goods and services. In major cities like New York and Chicago, the night sky glowed with the reflection of electric light. The darkness that had defined night for all of human history had been banished. It was not just the light that changed cities. Electric streetcars and later electric buses replaced the horse-drawn carriages that had dominated urban transportation. Electric motors powered factories, replacing the steam engines that had once filled cities with smoke and ash. Electric elevators made tall buildings practical. You could live or work on the 20th floor, knowing that electricity would lift you there. The very shape of cities changed because electricity made things possible that were never before possible. Skyscrapers became practical because electric elevators could move people efficiently up and down them. Factories could cluster in cities because electricity could be distributed from central power stations, rather than requiring each factory to have its own steam engine. Streets and public spaces became safer because electric light allowed visibility that gas lamps never could provide. And towering above all of this were the visual symbols of the new age: electric signs, neon lights, marquees advertising movies and entertainment. Cities glowed at night. They were radiant with light. They were transformed into something new, something that previous generations could not have imagined. The countryside, by contrast, remained dark. Rural areas did not have reliable electrical service. The divide between urban and rural life, between the electrically powered modern world and the pre-electrical world, became stark and visible. To live in a city lit by electricity, powered by electricity, connected by electricity, was to live in a fundamentally different kind of world than living in a rural area without electrical power. And people noticed. Electricity became synonymous with progress, with modernity, with civilization itself. The electrical age had arrived, and it had transformed not just how humans lived, but what kind of future seemed possible. E.J. Thomson's discovery. By the 1890s, scientists had learned to harness electricity, to transmit it, to use it to power machines and create light. But a fundamental question remained unanswered. What is electricity? What is it made of? What is the nature of this invisible force? In 1897, an English physicist named J.J. Thomson designed an elegant experiment to investigate. He created a cathode ray tube, a glass tube with the air removed, with metal electrodes at each end connected to a high voltage source. When he turned on the voltage, something remarkable happened. Rays of some kind emanated from the negative electrode, the cathode, and traveled through the vacuum to the positive electrode, the anode. These rays could be deflected by magnets and electric fields. Thomson was curious. He designed experiments to measure the mass of these rays and the charge they carried. And through careful measurement, he made a stunning discovery. The rays were not rays at all. They were particles. Tiny particles much smaller than atoms, and they were negatively charged. They were the carriers of electrical current. They were the fundamental units of electricity. Thomson called them electrons. The implications were extraordinary. Electricity was not a fluid or an invisible substance filling the space between matter. It was made of particles, tiny particles with negative charge. They were part of the atom itself. Matter and electricity were not separate. They were intimately connected. The atom was not, as had been believed, the smallest indivisible unit of matter. The atom had structure. It contained these tiny negatively charged electrons. This discovery opened an entirely new field of investigation. If the atom contained electrons, what else did it contain? How were electrons arranged? How did they move? How did the movement of electrons relate to electrical current and electrical phenomena? Thomson had revealed that electricity operated at a level of reality far smaller and far stranger than anyone had imagined. Electrons are waves and particles. As physicists investigated the nature of electrons in the early 20th century, they discovered something that challenged the very foundations of how they thought about reality. Electrons behaved strangely. Sometimes they behaved like particles, tiny balls of matter with definite position and momentum. Sometimes they behaved like waves, spreading out through space, interfering with other waves, exhibiting properties of wave-like phenomena. It was as if the electron was simultaneously both particle and wave, or as if the distinction between particles and waves was not fundamental to reality, but merely a limitation of human perception and description. Consider a classic experiment. If you send electrons through two slits, what happens? If electrons are particles, they should pass through one slit or the other, and you would expect a pattern of two lines on a screen behind the slits, one for electrons passing through each slit. But electrons don't do that. They behave like waves. They pass through both slits simultaneously. They interfere with themselves. They create an interference pattern, alternating bright and dark lines on the screen behind the slits. This is wave-like behavior. It's the same pattern you would see if you sent water waves or light waves through two slits. But here's the strangest part. If you set up detectors to see which slit each electron actually goes through, the electrons immediately stop behaving like waves. They start behaving like particles. They pass through one slit or the other. The interference pattern disappears. The act of observation changes the behavior. The electron seems to know it's being watched, and it responds by changing its behavior. This is not a limitation of our ability to measure. This is not a measurement error. This is the actual behavior of the electron. Reality at the quantum scale operates according to principles that are radically different from the physics that governs our everyday experience. The electron exists in a state of superposition. It is, in some sense, in multiple states simultaneously, until it is observed or measured, at which point it collapses into a definite state. This is not metaphor. This is the actual mathematical description of how electrons behave. And it revealed that electricity, at its most fundamental level, operates according to the strange rules of quantum mechanics. The universe is far weirder than anyone had imagined. Energy levels and quantum jumps. If electrons are quantum entities existing in superposition, how do they behave within atoms? In 1913, a Danish physicist named Niels Bohr proposed a model of the atom that incorporated quantum principles. In Bohr's model, electrons don't orbit the nucleus continuously like planets around the sun. Instead, they exist in discrete energy levels, or shells. An electron can exist at the lowest energy level, closest to the nucleus, or it can exist at a higher energy level, farther from the nucleus. But it cannot exist in between. There are no intermediate positions. The energy levels are discrete, separated by specific gaps. And here's the remarkable part. An electron can jump from one energy level to another, but only if it absorbs exactly the right amount of energy. It cannot partially jump. It cannot gradually rise to a higher level. It makes a discrete leap. If you give an electron exactly the right amount of energy, say, by striking it with a photon of light with just the right frequency, it jumps to a higher energy level. If you give it less energy, nothing happens. If you give it more energy than needed for the jump, the excess energy goes nowhere. The electron jumps and ignores the extra energy. This is called a quantum jump. And it revealed something profound. Energy itself is quantized. Energy comes in discrete packets called quanta. You cannot have an arbitrarily small amount of energy. You cannot have half a quantum jump. Reality at the quantum scale is granular, discrete, quantized. And when an electron in a higher energy level jumps back down to a lower level, it releases the energy it gained. This energy is released as a photon, a packet of light, and the frequency of that light is determined by the difference in energy between the two levels. This explained something that had puzzled scientists for decades: why atoms emit light at specific frequencies, creating discrete lines in their spectra rather than a continuous range of colors. Each line corresponds to an electron jumping from one energy level to another, releasing a photon of light with a specific frequency. Atoms are quantum systems. Electrons exist in quantum states. Light is quantized. Matter and energy are quantized. The fundamental nature of reality is granular, discrete, mathematical, strange beyond intuition. The cloud of probability. If electrons don't orbit nuclei like planets, what is their actual location? This question led to one of the most philosophically disturbing discoveries in the history of physics. In the 1920s, physicists developed a complete mathematical framework for quantum mechanics. Erwin Schrödinger developed an equation describing how quantum states evolve over time. Werner Heisenberg proved that you cannot simultaneously know both the exact position and exact momentum of an electron. There is a fundamental limit to how precisely you can specify both quantities, and the interpretation that emerged was both elegant and troubling. An electron does not have a definite location until it is measured. Instead, it exists in a probability cloud. The electron's position is described not by a single point in space, but by a probability distribution. There is a certain probability of finding the electron here, a smaller probability of finding it there, a tiny probability of finding it very far away. The mathematics is precise, but the physical interpretation is strange. In some sense, the electron is everywhere within the probability cloud simultaneously, with different probabilities at different locations. Only when you perform a measurement do you force the electron to reveal a specific location. Before measurement, it does not have a definite location. It exists in a superposition of possible locations. This is not because we lack information. This is not because we can't measure precisely enough. This is the actual state of reality. The electron genuinely does not have a definite position until it is measured. The act of measurement causes the probability cloud to collapse into a definite value. This interpretation, called the Copenhagen interpretation, is still debated among physicists. But it is the interpretation that best matches all the experimental evidence. And it means that reality at the quantum scale is fundamentally probabilistic. Certainty does not exist, only probability. The universe is not a deterministic mechanism like a clock. It is a vast web of probabilities and possibilities that collapse into actuality only when observed or measured. This is what electricity looks like when you look at it at the most fundamental level. It is not a flow of particles. It is a flow of probability clouds. It is waves and particles simultaneously. It is discrete and continuous. It is quantized and smooth. It is stranger and more wonderful than any mythology ever imagined. Semiconductors and Control. But understanding the quantum nature of electrons was not merely an intellectual exercise. It had practical implications. In the 1930s, scientists discovered materials called semiconductors. Semiconductors are elements like silicon and germanium that have an unusual property. Their ability to conduct electricity can be controlled. Pure silicon barely conducts electricity at all. But if you add impurities to silicon in a careful way, you can make it conduct electricity. And by controlling the amount of impurity, you can control how much it conducts. Even more remarkably, by applying an electrical voltage to a semiconductor, you can control whether it conducts electricity or blocks it. A semiconductor can act as a gate that opens and closes to allow or prevent the flow of electricity. This ability to control the flow of electricity using another voltage meant that semiconductors could be used as switches. Tiny switches that could be turned on and off electronically. They could also be used as amplifiers. A small voltage applied to a semiconductor could control the flow of a much larger current. The understanding of quantum mechanics, how electrons behave in semiconductors at the quantum level, made possible the creation of devices that could precisely control and amplify electrical current. This was revolutionary because it meant that electricity could be made to carry information. A controlled flow of electricity could represent a message, a calculation, a command. Electricity could be made to think. The Transistor Revolution. In 1947, at Bell Laboratories in New Jersey, 3 physicists named John Bardeen, Leon Brattain, and William Shockley demonstrated a device that would change the world more profoundly than any invention since electricity itself. They called it the transistor. The transistor was a tiny semiconductor device that could amplify or switch electrical signals. It was constructed from germanium, a semiconductor. By applying a voltage to one part of the transistor, you could control the flow of current through another part. The transistor could amplify weak signals, making them stronger. The transistor could switch on and off incredibly rapidly. The transistor could do this while consuming very little power and generating very little heat. The transistor was revolutionary compared to the vacuum tubes that had been used previously. Vacuum tubes were large, fragile, consumed enormous amounts of power, and generated tremendous heat. Transistors were tiny, robust, consumed minimal power, and stayed cool. A device that once required thousands of vacuum tubes and filled an entire room could now be built with transistors and fit in your hand. The transistor made possible the miniaturization of electronic devices. And more importantly, the transistor made possible the computer as we know it. Computers could be built from transistors. Millions of transistors could be packed into a small space. Transistors could be switched on and off incredibly rapidly, billions of times per second. Transistors could be connected together in logical circuits that could perform calculations. The transistor was, in essence, electricity that had learned to think. It was the bridge between the quantum behavior of electrons in semiconductors and the logical operations of computers. And it changed everything. The world of electronics was no longer dominated by large, expensive, power-hungry devices. It became a world where miniaturization was possible, where compact devices could have incredible power, where electronics could be embedded in everyday objects. The age of the computer had begun, powered by transistors, which were themselves manifestations of quantum mechanical principles translated into useful technology. Boolean logic made physical. But transistors alone were not enough to build a computer. You needed to know how to use them. You needed a system of logic that transistors could implement. In the 1840s, an English mathematician named George Boole had developed a system of logic, now called Boolean algebra, that could express logical operations using mathematical symbols. In Boolean logic, everything is reduced to true or false, 1 or 0, on or off. You can express logical operations and, or not, if-then. You can combine these operations to create complex logical expressions. Boole had no idea that his abstract system of symbolic logic would, a century later, become the foundation of computing. But when transistors made it possible to build devices that were either on or off, that could switch between on and off, Boolean logic suddenly became not just mathematically elegant, but physically realizable. A transistor could represent a true or false value. It could be on or off. A circuit of transistors could implement Boolean logic operations. Multiple transistors working together could express complex logical statements. And if you could express logical statements physically, you could perform logical operations. You could perform calculations. You could perform symbolic manipulations. You could, in essence, perform thinking. Humans had created electricity to power machines and lights. Now, humans had discovered how to make electricity perform logic. Electricity could flow in patterns that represented yes or no, true or false, 1 or 0. Electricity could be arranged in circuits that answered logical questions. Electricity could compute. This was the revelation that made the modern computer possible. Boolean logic, electricity, and semiconductors combined to create devices that could think, or at least simulate thinking, in ways that were strikingly similar to how human brains perform calculations and logical operations. The first computers. In 1946, at the University of Pennsylvania, a massive machine was unveiled called ENIAC, the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer. It was the first general-purpose electronic computer. It was enormous, filling an entire room. It weighed 30 tons. It consumed 150 kilowatts of electrical power, enough power to illuminate hundreds of homes. It generated so much heat that the room had to be cooled with special air conditioning systems. But it could compute. It could perform thousands of calculations per second. It could solve mathematical problems that would take a human with a pencil and paper weeks or months to work through. ENIAC demonstrated that the basic principles were sound. Electricity could be organized into logical circuits. Those circuits could perform calculations. The calculations could be controlled by programs, sequences of instructions that told the computer what operations to perform. ENIAC was built with vacuum tubes, not transistors. Transistors had only just been invented when ENIAC was completed. But it proved the concept. The electronic computer was possible. Within a few years, computers were being built with transistors. They were smaller, faster, more reliable, and consumed far less power than ENIAC. They were still enormous by modern standards, filling rooms, requiring specialized cooling systems, costing hundreds of thousands of dollars. But they worked, and they demonstrated that the principle was sound. Electricity could be made to think. Electricity could be taught logic. Electricity could perform the operations of calculation and reasoning. The age of the computer had begun. Transistors replace vacuum tubes. The early computers of the 1940s and 1950s were built with vacuum tubes. These tubes were fragile, prone to burning out, and had to be constantly replaced. They consumed enormous amounts of power and generated tremendous heat. A single computer failure might require technicians to test thousands of vacuum tubes to find the one that had burned out. It was tedious, expensive, and unreliable. Then transistors came. As transistor technology matured in the 1950s and 60s, computers began to be built with transistors instead of vacuum tubes. Transistors were smaller, more reliable, consumed less power, and generated less heat. Computers using transistors could be smaller and run cooler. They could perform more operations with less power. They were far more reliable. As transistor technology improved, computers got faster, smaller, and cheaper. By the 1960s, transistors had completely replaced vacuum tubes. The transition was swift and inevitable. Transistor-based computers were simply superior in every way. And the improvement didn't stop. Transistor technology continued to advance. Transistors got smaller. More transistors could be packed into the same space. Computers got faster. By the 1970s, it became possible to put millions of transistors on a single silicon chip. By the 1980s, billions of transistors could fit on a chip smaller than a fingernail. The miniaturization was astounding. And with miniaturization came possibility. Computers that once required entire rooms could now fit on a desktop. Computers that once cost hundreds of thousands of dollars could now be purchased for under $1,000. Computers began to proliferate. They entered offices, homes, schools. They became ubiquitous. And none of it would have been possible without the transistor, without semiconductors, without the understanding of quantum mechanics that made semiconductors possible. Moore's law accelerates. In 1965, an engineer named Gordon Moore made an observation. He observed that the number of transistors that could fit on a silicon chip was doubling roughly every 2 years. As technology improved, manufacturers could make transistors smaller, fitting more of them on the same sized chip. And this doubling was happening reliably, predictably, year after year. Moore predicted that this trend would continue for at least the next decade. He was right, and it continued far longer than a decade. For the next several decades, the number of transistors on a chip doubled approximately every 2 years. This became known as Moore's law. Moore's law was not a law of physics. It was an observation about technological progress, a trend that resulted from the combined efforts of thousands of engineers and scientists working to improve semiconductor manufacturing. But it had profound implications. If the number of transistors was doubling every 2 years, then the power and capability of computers was doubling every 2 years. A computer in 1975 had roughly the same computing power as a computer from 1973, but it might cost half as much. A computer in 1985 had the computing power of 100 computers from 1975. A computer from 1995 had the power of thousands of computers from 1985. The exponential growth was staggering, and it continued. Personal computers in the 1980s were more powerful than the room-filling mainframes of the 1960s. Laptops in the 1990s were more powerful than the personal computers of the 1980s. Mobile phones in the 2000s contained more computing power than computers that had cost millions of dollars just decades earlier. Moore's law drove an exponential acceleration in computing power. And that exponential acceleration powered the digital revolution. Every aspect of modern life, communication, commerce, entertainment, information, became digital, became computational, became dependent on the exponential growth of computing power enabled by transistors becoming smaller, cheaper, and more numerous. And all of it traced back to the understanding of quantum mechanics and semiconductors, to the transistor, to the discovery that electricity could be made to perform logic. We are now the passengers. Consider what has happened. Humans discovered electricity. We learned to harness it, to transmit it, to use it. Then we learned that electricity was made of electrons, quantum entities following strange rules. We learned that we could control the flow of electrons in semiconductors. We built transistors. We built computers from transistors. We made the computers smaller and smaller, more and more powerful. We built networks of computers. We connected the computers together into the internet. We wrote programs for the computers to run. And now, something profound has happened. We have built machines that are, in many ways, more capable at certain tasks than we are. Computers can process information faster than human brains. They can perform calculations more accurately. They can recognize patterns in vast datasets faster than humans ever could. They can generate text and images according to patterns they've learned from vast amounts of training data. We have created electricity that thinks faster than we do. We have created electricity that, in certain domains, thinks better than we do. The relationship has inverted. Humans did not just create electricity as a tool to serve our purposes. We have become, in a very real sense, servants of the electricity that we created. We maintain the power plants that generate it. We maintain the networks that transmit it. We maintain the computers that use it. We organize our lives around the rhythms of computing. We follow the recommendations of algorithms powered by electricity. We entrust our most important decisions to systems driven by electrical computation. We are now the passengers. Electricity is the driver. And the story is not over. It is accelerating. It is becoming more complex. It is becoming more integrated into every aspect of human existence. The electricity that began as lightning in the sky has become the invisible infrastructure upon which all of modern civilization depends. We created it to serve us. In doing so, we have created something that transcends us, something that is beginning to have its own kind of agency, its own kind of power. We have made electricity intelligent, and now we live in the world that electricity has created. The neural impulse. Throughout this entire story, we have been describing electricity outside the body, in the sky, in wires, in circuits. But there is another electricity, far more intimate. The electricity that runs your body. That creates your thoughts. That makes you alive. It has been there all along, ever since life first emerged from the ocean billions of years ago. Every cell in your body is an electrical system. But neurons, the cells that make up your brain and your nervous system, are the true electrical specialists. A neuron is a cell designed to transmit electrical signals. It has a body containing the nucleus, and extending from it are long, thin projections called axons and dendrites. An axon can be extraordinarily long. Some axons in your spinal cord extend from your brain all the way to your feet, a distance of several feet in a single continuous projection. Along this axon, electrical signals travel. But how? How does a neuron generate electrical signals? The answer involves charged particles, ions, distributed inside and outside the cell. The cell maintains a difference in electrical charge across its membrane. Inside the cell, there are more negatively charged ions. Outside the cell, there are more positively charged ions. This creates an electrical potential, a voltage difference between the inside and outside of the cell. At rest, this voltage is about -70 millivolts. The inside is negative relative to the outside. This is the resting potential, and it is fundamental to how neurons work. When a neuron is stimulated, when it receives a signal from another neuron, something remarkable happens. Ion channels in the cell membrane open. Positively charged ions flood into the cell. The voltage of the cell suddenly becomes less negative. It depolarizes. If the depolarization reaches a certain threshold, the cell initiates an action potential. This is an electrical wave that propagates down the axon. Voltage-gated ion channels open and close in sequence along the axon. Positive ions rush in, making the membrane potential positive. Then potassium ions rush out, making it negative again. This wave of electrical activity, this action potential, travels down the axon at speeds of up to 100 meters per second. It is an electrical pulse, and it carries a message from one end of the neuron to the other. When the action potential reaches the end of the axon, it triggers the release of chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. These chemicals diffuse across the gap between neurons and bind to receptors on the next neuron. This either excites or inhibits the next neuron. The electrical signal has been transformed into a chemical signal, which triggers another electrical signal in the downstream neuron. It is a chain reaction. One neuron fires an action potential. That triggers the next neuron to fire, and the next, and the next. Millions of neurons firing action potentials in coordinated patterns, and those patterns are your thoughts. Those patterns are your sensations. Those patterns are your consciousness. Ion channels open and close. The action potential seems simple when described this way. Ions flow in. Ions flow in. Ions flow out. An electrical wave propagates, but the mechanism is far more intricate and far more wonderful. The cell membrane contains protein molecules called ion channels. These are channels that allow ions to pass through the membrane. But they don't just allow ions to flow freely. They open and close. And their opening and closing is controlled by the electrical voltage across the membrane and by chemical signals. When a neuron is at rest, most of the ion channels are closed. The ions are blocked from passing through. The electrical potential is maintained. But when the neuron is stimulated, some ion channels open. Specifically, sodium channels open. Sodium is a positively charged ion that is far more concentrated outside the cell than inside. When sodium channels open, sodium ions rush into the cell, driven by both the concentration gradient and the electrical gradient. As positive ions enter, they depolarize the cell. They make the interior less negative. This depolarization is detected by voltage-gated sodium channels. When the voltage reaches a certain threshold, these channels open explosively. More sodium ions rush in. The depolarization accelerates. It becomes self-reinforcing. In less than a millisecond, the membrane potential has flipped from -70 millivolts to +30 millivolts. The inside of the cell is now positive relative to the outside. But as the membrane becomes more positive, something else happens. The sodium channels become inactivated. They close, and they cannot open again immediately. They are refractory. At the same time, potassium channels open. Potassium ions, which are far more concentrated inside the cell than outside, rush out. As positive potassium ions leave, they repolarize the cell. They make the interior negative again. The potassium channels have a delay built into them. They open more slowly than the sodium channels and stay open longer. This ensures that the cell repolarizes completely, overshoots back to a more negative potential, and then gradually drifts back to rest. The entire process, depolarization, repolarization, return to rest, takes about 1 to 2 milliseconds. The precision is extraordinary. The timing is exquisite. And it all results from proteins responding to electrical and chemical signals, opening and closing ion channels in perfect sequence. This is what life looks like at the cellular level. This is electricity writing biology. This is the fundamental mechanism of thought, sensation, and consciousness. The resting potential. But how does the cell maintain this electrical gradient in the first place? How does it keep more positive ions outside and more negative ions inside? The answer involves a molecular machine called the sodium-potassium pump. The sodium-potassium pump is a protein embedded in the cell membrane. It uses chemical energy in the form of ATP, the universal energy currency of cells, to actively transport ions against their concentration gradients. It pumps 3 sodium ions out of the cell for every 2 potassium ions it pumps in. This takes energy. It takes a significant fraction of all the energy your body uses. Roughly a quarter of all the energy consumed by your brain is dedicated to maintaining the ion gradients across neuronal membranes. Your brain is using a quarter of your body's energy just to maintain the electrical potentials that allow thinking to happen. This is why the brain consumes so much energy. It's not the thinking itself. It's the maintenance of the gradients that make thinking possible. The sodium-potassium pump creates an imbalance. It creates a situation where there is a higher concentration of positive ions outside the cell and a higher concentration of negative ions inside. This imbalance creates an electrical gradient. The gradient is the resting potential. The resting potential is the baseline condition of a neuron at rest. And it is not a passive state. It is an active, energy-consuming state. Your neurons are constantly working, constantly pumping ions, constantly maintaining gradients, even when you are sleeping. Life is electrical work. Even when you are at rest, electricity is flowing through your neurons. Even in sleep, your brain is maintaining the electrical structure that is the basis of your consciousness. This resting potential, this quiet electrical foundation, is perhaps the most important thing happening in your body at any given moment, because without it, consciousness would cease. Thought would stop. Experience would vanish. You would cease to exist. The resting potential is what keeps you alive. It is what keeps you conscious. It is the foundation of everything you experience. Action potentials cascade. Imagine a single neuron firing an action potential. One electrical pulse traveling down an axon. It triggers the release of neurotransmitters at the synapse. The neurotransmitters diffuse across the gap and bind to receptors on the next neuron. This causes some of the ion channels on the next neuron to open. This depolarizes the next neuron slightly. If the depolarization is strong enough, it reaches the threshold for firing an action potential. The next neuron fires. Its action potential triggers another neuron, and another, and another. Within milliseconds, a cascade of action potentials has spread from the initially stimulated neuron to hundreds of downstream neurons. And each of those neurons triggers hundreds more. The cascade spreads through the brain like waves rippling across water. In reality, the metaphor of waves is inadequate. It's not a simple wave. It's a complex three-dimensional cascade of electrical activity, with neurons exciting some downstream neurons and inhibiting others, creating patterns of activation and inhibition. Some neurons fire. Some neurons are suppressed. The pattern of activity is the information. The pattern of cascading action potentials is a thought. Consider what happens when you see something. Light enters your eye. It strikes the retina. Photoreceptor cells in the retina detect the light and generate electrical signals. Those signals cascade through the layers of the retina to the optic nerve. The optic nerve carries the electrical signals to the brain. In the visual cortex, the cascade of signals creates a pattern of neuronal firing. That pattern of electrical activity is your perception of the object. It is your visual experience. The photons have been converted to electrical signals. Those electrical signals have cascaded through networks of neurons. The pattern of electrical activity is your conscious experience of seeing. In that moment, you are a pattern of electrical activity. You are, in a very real sense, electricity having an experience of itself. The heartbeat's rhythm. Electricity is not confined to the brain and nervous system. Your heart is also an electrical organ. The heart is a muscle, and like all muscles, it contracts when electrical signals cause ion channels to open and ions to flow. But the heart has something special. It has its own electrical system. Within the heart, there is a region called the sinoatrial node. This is the heart's natural pacemaker. The cells of the sinoatrial node spontaneously generate electrical signals. They don't need to be stimulated. They fire action potentials automatically, rhythmically, approximately once per second. This generates an electrical pulse. The pulse spreads through the walls of the heart. It causes the heart muscle to contract. The contraction is coordinated. It squeezes the heart in a specific pattern that efficiently pumps blood. The electrical signal then reaches the ventricles at the bottom of the heart. It causes them to contract, pushing blood out into the arteries. Then the electrical activity stops. The muscles relax. The heart refills with blood. And then the sinoatrial node fires again. The entire cycle repeats. About 60 to 100 times per minute. 60 to 100 heartbeats. 60 to 100 times per minute. Electrical signals are coordinating the contraction of your heart muscle. If those electrical signals become irregular, the heartbeat becomes irregular. Arrhythmia is a condition where the electrical signals in the heart are chaotic or out of sync. The heart cannot pump efficiently. Blood pools in the chambers. Clots can form. The person may lose consciousness. If the arrhythmia is severe enough, the person may die. The solution is defibrillation. A strong electrical shock is delivered to the heart. The shock disrupts the chaotic electrical activity. It resets the heart's electrical system. The sinoatrial node, being the strongest electrical pacemaker, reasserts its natural rhythm. The heartbeat returns to normal. The person lives. It is extraordinary. A person's life can be saved by another electrical shock applied to the heart. We use electricity to heal electricity. We use a precisely timed electrical signal to restore the normal electrical rhythm of the heart. The heart is fundamentally electrical. It is a clock driven by electricity. And when that clock stops or becomes irregular, only electricity can fix it. The brain's electrical symphony. Imagine looking at a living brain. If you could visualize the electrical activity, what would you see? You would see a symphony of electrical activity. Millions of neurons firing. Billions of synapses transmitting signals. Cascades of action potentials spreading through networks. Waves of electrical activity oscillating at different frequencies. Some waves are fast, gamma oscillations at 40 Hz or higher, associated with conscious perception and attention. Some are slower, theta oscillations at 4 to 8 Hz, associated with memory formation and navigation. Some are very slow, delta oscillations at half a Hz to 4 Hz, associated with deep sleep and restoration. Your brain is not a still place. It is constantly moving, constantly oscillating, constantly generating electrical activity. And this electrical activity is not chaotic. It is highly organized. Different regions of the brain oscillate at different frequencies. Rhythms in different regions synchronize with each other. Phase locking occurs where the rhythms in different regions align. This synchronization, this coherence of electrical activity across different parts of the brain, is associated with consciousness. When you are awake and conscious, your brain exhibits rhythmic electrical activity that is synchronized across multiple regions. When you fall into deep sleep, the synchronization is disrupted. The rhythms become more chaotic. When you wake up, the synchronization returns. Consciousness correlates with synchronized electrical activity. Without the synchronized electrical oscillations, there is no consciousness. The electrical symphony is the mind. The music of the neurons is thought. Everything that you experience, everything that you think, everything that you feel is generated by electrical activity in your brain. The electrical activity cascades from neuron to neuron. Cascades trigger cascades. Patterns emerge. The patterns are dynamic. They are constantly changing. But they maintain structure and coherence. And that structure and coherence, that electrical symphony, is you. When the symphony stops, you cease. When the symphony becomes disorganized, your thoughts become disorganized. When the symphony becomes too slow, you become sluggish. When it becomes too fast, you become anxious. The quality and character of your electrical brain activity determines the quality and character of your experience. You are electricity. Your consciousness is electrical. Your thoughts are electrical. Your emotions are electrical. Your sense of self is an electrical pattern. And when you understand that, when you truly grasp that you are electricity having an experience of itself, something profound shifts. You begin to see electricity not as a force external to you, but as the very basis of what you are. The EEG reveals patterns. In 1924, a German psychiatrist named Hans Berger made a remarkable discovery. He placed electrodes on the scalp of a human subject and connected them to a sensitive measuring device called a galvanometer. The galvanometer could detect tiny electrical currents, and to his astonishment, he detected electrical currents in the brain. Waves of electrical activity were being generated by billions of neurons firing. These waves were large enough to be detected through the skull and scalp. Berger had invented the electroencephalogram, or EEG. The EEG became a window into the electrical activity of the brain. Different patterns of electrical activity could be detected, measured, and recorded. When a person was awake and alert, the EEG showed fast, irregular waves. When a person was drowsy, the waves slowed. When a person fell into deep sleep, the waves became even slower and more regular. Different brain states had characteristic electrical signatures. The EEG revealed something profound. Consciousness itself has an electrical signature. You could tell what state a person's brain was in just by looking at the pattern of electrical activity. An awake brain looks different electrically than a sleeping brain. An anxious brain looks different than a calm brain. A brain having a seizure looks completely different from a normal brain. The EEG opened new possibilities for understanding the brain. Doctors could diagnose epilepsy by observing the characteristic electrical abnormalities in an EEG. They could identify sleep disorders. They could study what happened to the brain during sleep, during meditation, during different mental tasks. The EEG showed that the brain was constantly generating rhythmic electrical activity. Consciousness was not a static state. It was a dynamic, oscillating, constantly changing pattern of electrical activity. And you could see it. You could measure it. You could study it. The EEG made the electrical nature of consciousness visible. For the first time, the subjective experience of consciousness could be correlated with objective measurements of electrical activity. When a person reported having a vivid dream, the EEG showed a characteristic pattern. When a person was making a difficult decision, the EEG showed different patterns of activity in different brain regions. When a person was experiencing an emotion, the electrical activity changed. Consciousness, it seemed, was written in electrical patterns. And the EEG could read those patterns. Heart rate variability. While neuroscientists were studying the electrical patterns in the brain, cardiologists were discovering something equally remarkable about the electrical patterns in the heart. The heart does not beat at a perfectly constant rate. Even in a calm, resting person, the time between heartbeats varies slightly. Sometimes the heart beats slightly faster, sometimes slightly slower. This variation is called heart rate variability, or HRV. For decades, heart rate variability was considered a kind of noise, an imperfection in the heart's rhythm. But in the 1960s and 70s, researchers began to realize that HRV was not noise. It was information. Heart rate variability reflects the electrical signaling of the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system has two branches, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system prepares the body for action. It increases heart rate, blood pressure, and stress hormones. The parasympathetic nervous system promotes rest and recovery. It decreases heart rate and activates digestion. These two branches are constantly adjusting the heart rate through electrical signals. In a healthy person, the parasympathetic nervous system exerts constant influence. It keeps the heart rate lower than its intrinsic rate, which would be higher if left to its own devices. This parasympathetic influence is what creates heart rate variability. The heart rate varies minute to minute, second to second, as the parasympathetic nervous system makes constant micro-adjustments. When a person is stressed, the sympathetic nervous system increases its influence. The parasympathetic influence diminishes. Heart rate variability decreases. The heart becomes more rigid, less variable. This is a sign of stress. When a person is calm and relaxed, parasympathetic influence is strong. Heart rate variability is high. The heart responds dynamically and flexibly to changing conditions. This is a sign of health. Heart rate variability became a measure of emotional state. High HRV indicates calm, relaxation, and a flexible nervous system that can respond appropriately to challenges. Low HRV indicates stress, anxiety, and a nervous system that is locked in a defensive posture. Remarkably, HRV is correlated with health outcomes. People with high HRV tend to be healthier, live longer, and have better mental health. People with low HRV are at higher risk for heart disease, depression, and other health problems. Your heart is not just pumping blood. It is broadcasting electrical information about your emotional state. It is communicating with the rest of your body and the rest of your nervous system. And the pattern of that communication, the heart rate variability, is a reflection of your deepest state. Your heart's electrical rhythm is a window into your soul. Bioelectric fields. Beyond the brain and heart, researchers began to discover something even more profound. Living organisms generate electrical fields around themselves. These fields extend beyond the physical body. They can be detected and measured using sensitive instruments. In the 1930s, a researcher named Harold Saxon Burr made astonishing discoveries. He found that living organisms generated electrical fields, and remarkably, the shape of the electrical field was closely related to the shape of the organism. He called this the L field, for life field. Different organisms had different characteristic electrical field patterns. Salamanders had fields with specific shapes. Frog eggs had fields that seemed to guide the development of the embryo. Human beings generated distinctive electrical fields. Burr proposed that the electrical field might play a role in biological organization, in guiding how an organism develops and maintains its shape. This was a radical idea. The conventional understanding was that biological development was guided purely by genetics, by the DNA that codes for proteins. The genes determined the proteins. The proteins determined the structure. But Burr was suggesting that there was another layer of organization, an electrical layer. The organism's electrical field might be providing additional guidance. Burr's ideas were ahead of their time. They were largely dismissed by mainstream biology. But decades later, modern researchers would find evidence that he was onto something profound. Organisms do indeed generate measurable electrical fields, and these fields do seem to play a role in biological development and organization. The electrical field is not separate from the genetic blueprint. It works in concert with it. DNA provides the molecular machinery. The electrical field organizes how that machinery is deployed. Life is not purely chemical. It is biochemical and bioelectrical. The electrical fields are as important as the chemistry. The surprising discovery. In the early 2021s, a developmental biologist named Michael Levin made a stunning discovery that would reshape our understanding of bioelectricity. Levin was studying tadpoles of the African clawed frog, Xenopus. He was investigating how the tadpole develops a specific shape, a head with eyes, a body, a tail. He knew that genes provided the instructions for the proteins. But how did those proteins assemble into the right shape? How did the tadpole know to grow eyes in the right place on the head? Levin decided to investigate whether electrical properties of cells might play a role. He used a drug to alter the electrical properties of certain cells. Specifically, he altered the ion channels in cells, changing their electrical potential. This should have been a minor perturbation. The genes were still the same. The cells were genetically identical to normal cells, but the electrical properties were different. And when the tadpole developed, something extraordinary happened. It grew eyes in the wrong place. It grew a partially developed eye in the middle of the body, where eyes should never be. Levin had demonstrated that bioelectric signals could override genetic instructions about body plan. The same genetic code could result in a very different body shape if the electrical properties were altered. Levin went further. He used other perturbations to induce even more radical changes. He created tadpoles that had eyes in completely inappropriate locations. He created tadpoles that grew structures that should never grow. The tadpoles were still viable. They could still move around, still respond to stimuli. But their body plans had been dramatically altered by manipulating electrical signals. This was extraordinary. It demonstrated that genetics alone does not determine body shape. Electrical signals, bioelectric signals, must be playing a crucial role. The genes provide the tools. But the bioelectric field provides the blueprint. Levin called this concept the morphogenetic field. The electrical field guides how the genetic tools are deployed. It's as if DNA is like a construction crew, and the bioelectric field is like an architectural plan. You can have the same construction crew, but if you give them a different plan, they'll build something different. Levin's discoveries suggested that the living organism is not just a chemical machine. It is a bioelectrical system in which electrical signals guide and coordinate biological development. This opens profound possibilities. If you can change the bioelectric field, you can potentially change what the organism develops into. You can potentially reprogram how cells assemble. You can potentially create hybrid organisms with features that nature never would have produced. But more fundamentally, it suggests that consciousness and biological form are not separate. They are both expressions of the electrical nature of life. The electrical field is not a byproduct of biological activity. It is a fundamental organizing principle. Life is electricity organizing itself into increasingly complex patterns. Rethinking life itself. If electricity is not just a communication system in the nervous system, but a fundamental organizing principle of life itself, then we need to rethink what life is. Life is not just chemistry. Life is chemistry organized by electrical fields. DNA does not contain all the information needed to build and maintain an organism. DNA contains information about proteins, but the proteins need to assemble into the right shapes, in the right places, at the right times. This assembly is guided by electrical fields. The organism is a bioelectrical system. It is a pattern of electrical organization. The organism maintains itself by maintaining its electrical pattern. If the electrical pattern is disrupted, the organism becomes diseased. If the electrical pattern is destroyed, the organism dies. Consciousness, in this view, is not exclusively a phenomenon of the brain. Consciousness is a property of organized electrical systems. A brain generates consciousness because it is a highly organized electrical system. But other systems might generate forms of consciousness too. A heart maintains a kind of awareness of the body's electrical state through heart rate variability. The immune system coordinates its activity through electrical signaling. Single-celled organisms respond to electrical fields and adjust their behavior accordingly. Perhaps consciousness is not binary, something you either have or don't have. Perhaps consciousness is a spectrum, a property that all electrical systems possess to some degree. A simple organism with a simple electrical system might have a simple form of consciousness. A human brain with billions of neurons and trillions of synapses has a complex, rich consciousness. But the principle is the same. Electrical organization generates experience. The more complex the electrical organization, the more complex the experience. This is a radical idea. It suggests that electricity is not just something that the brain uses. Electricity is the very foundation of what we are. It is the basis of our existence. It is what makes us alive. It is what makes us conscious. And it is not confined to our brains. It is flowing through our entire bodies, coordinating everything, maintaining everything, making everything possible. We are not machines that happen to have electricity flowing through them. We are electricity that has organized itself into a form that experiences itself. The explanatory gap. We understand electricity. We understand its physics, its behavior, its mathematical description. We can predict how electricity will flow through a circuit. We can design systems using electricity. We can create computers that perform calculations. We understand the electricity in the brain at the level of ions, channels, and neurons. We can measure electrical activity. We can see which parts of the brain are active during different mental tasks. We can correlate electrical patterns with reported experiences. But there remains a profound mystery, a gap that has never been bridged. We can explain the electricity. We can measure it. We can show that consciousness correlates with certain patterns of electrical activity. But we cannot explain why electricity feels like something. We cannot explain why electrical activity in your brain generates the subjective experience of seeing red, or feeling pain, or experiencing joy. This is the hard problem of consciousness. It is called hard, not because it is difficult to solve, but because it seems fundamentally different from other scientific problems. When you see the color red, something is happening in your brain. Photons are entering your eye. They are triggering electrical signals in the retina. Those signals are cascading through the visual system to the cortex. Specific neurons are firing. Specific patterns of electrical activity are unfolding. We can describe all of this. We can measure all of this. But we cannot explain why these electrical patterns feel like seeing red. We cannot explain why there is something it is like to see red, as opposed to no experience at all. This is the explanatory gap. It is the space between objective description and subjective experience, between the third-person view of electrical activity and the first-person view of consciousness. A complete description of all the electrical and chemical activity in your brain would not, apparently, tell you what it is like to see red. There seems to be something additional, something that science cannot capture. Some philosophers argue that consciousness is non-physical, that it cannot be fully explained by describing physical processes. Others argue that consciousness is indeed physical, but that our current concepts and descriptions are inadequate. They argue that we need new frameworks, new ways of thinking about physical processes to bridge the gap. Still others argue that the gap is illusory, that once we understand the brain fully enough, the hard problem will dissolve. We will realize that we were asking the wrong question. But the hard problem persists. It remains one of the deepest mysteries in science, and it is intimately connected to electricity, because electricity is the basis of consciousness. And yet we cannot explain why electrical activity generates experience. We are confronted with a fundamental mystery about the nature of reality itself. Integrated information theory. In the early 2000s, a neuroscientist named Giulio Tononi proposed a novel framework for understanding consciousness. He called it Integrated Information Theory, or DAO-IT. DET starts with an observation. Consciousness seems to have certain properties. It is unified. When you are conscious, you have a single, integrated experience, not a collection of disconnected sensations. It is informative. Your conscious experience conveys vast amounts of information. It differentiates between countless possible states. A unified, informative experience. Tononi hypothesized that consciousness might arise from information integration. He proposed a mathematical measure called phi, which quantifies how much a system integrates information. A system with high phi integrates a lot of information. It generates a unified, informative state. A system with low phi generates little integrated information. It might process information, but not in an integrated way. Tononi proposed that consciousness arises when a physical system has high integrated information. The more integrated information, the more consciousness. A simple system with low phi would have low consciousness or no consciousness at all. A complex system with high phi would have high consciousness. This provides a scale. It suggests that consciousness is not binary, but gradual. Different systems could have different amounts of consciousness depending on their level of information integration. Remarkably, this framework makes a prediction. Consciousness is not exclusive to brains. Any system that integrates information would have consciousness. A thermostat, technically, integrates information. It measures temperature and adjusts heating. But it integrates very little information. By TT's measure, it would have very low consciousness. A human brain, with billions of neurons and trillions of connections integrating vast amounts of information, would have very high consciousness. But the principle is the same. Consciousness is a property of information integration. It is a property that all systems that integrate information possess to some degree. DET suggests a universe in which consciousness is not rare or special. Consciousness is a fundamental property of systems that organize information in integrated ways. And electricity, being the basis of information integration in biological systems, is intimately connected to consciousness. The electrical complexity of your brain generates consciousness through integrated information. The electrical patterns are not separate from consciousness. They are the physical manifestation of consciousness. This is a profound shift in perspective. It suggests that consciousness is not something mysterious and non-physical. It is a natural property of physical systems that organize information in certain ways. And the hard problem may not be unsolvable. It may be that we need to understand consciousness not as something separate from electrical activity, but as a fundamental property that emerges from electrical organization. The hard problem persists. And yet, even with integrated information theory and other frameworks, the hard problem remains. DET can predict which systems should be conscious. It can measure the level of consciousness. But it cannot explain why information integration feels like something. It cannot explain why having a high phi value corresponds to subjective experience. It cannot bridge the explanatory gap. Consider a thought experiment. Imagine an artificial system designed to perfectly mimic the electrical activity of a human brain. Every neuron is simulated. Every synapse is simulated. Every pattern of activity is replicated exactly. The system processes information identically to a human brain. It would have the same phi value. According to 3, it would have the same level of consciousness. But would it have subjective experience? Would it feel like something to be that system? We don't know. We cannot know from the outside. We cannot measure consciousness. We can only infer it from behavior or from our own introspection. This is the hard problem in its starkest form. We have a complete physical description. We have a theory that predicts consciousness. And we still cannot explain why the physical system generates experience. Some scientists argue that consciousness is an illusion, that the feeling of subjective experience is itself an artifact of how our brain represents information. We don't actually have consciousness. We merely think we do because of how our brain is structured. But this seems wrong. Your consciousness is the only thing you can be certain of. Descartes was right. I think, therefore I am. The one undeniable fact of existence is that you are experiencing something right now. Whatever consciousness is, it is real. And whatever it is intimately bound up with electricity. Electricity is necessary for consciousness. Disrupt the electrical activity in your brain, and consciousness ceases. But is electricity sufficient for consciousness? Does electrical activity automatically generate consciousness? Or is something else required? These questions remain open. They are among the deepest questions in science and philosophy. And they will likely not be answered by purely physical description. They may require new ways of thinking, new frameworks, new philosophical approaches. The hard problem persists, but it does not diminish the importance of electricity. Electricity is the foundation. Whether or not electricity is sufficient to explain consciousness, it is absolutely necessary. You are made of electricity. Your mind is electrical. And the nature of electricity and consciousness remains one of the great mysteries of existence. Electrical storms of mental illness. Depression is often described as darkness. A patient in depression sees the world through a gray lens. Everything is heavy. Everything is difficult. Motivation vanishes. Joy becomes impossible. But depression is not purely psychological. It is electrical. Brain imaging of depressed individuals shows abnormal patterns of electrical activity. Certain regions of the brain that are normally active become quiet. Other regions that should be quiet become overactive. The electrical symphony is out of balance. The normal rhythms are disrupted. And when the rhythms are disrupted, the experience is disrupted. The person experiences depression. Bipolar disorder is another electrical disorder. In the manic phase, electrical activity in the brain accelerates dramatically. The person thinks faster, talks faster, experiences intense euphoria. The electrical rhythm is racing. In the depressive phase, the electrical rhythm crashes. The activity plummets. The person experiences crushing depression. The cycle between mania and depression is a cycle of electrical extremes. Schizophrenia is characterized by electrical dysrhythmias, disconnections between different brain regions that should be coordinated. The electrical symphony loses coherence. And as the coherence breaks down, so does the person's experience of reality. They may experience hallucinations, perceptions with no external cause, generated purely by the brain's electrical activity. They may experience delusions, false beliefs generated by faulty electrical processing. Their sense of self may fragment. Their ability to distinguish thought from perception may break down. Anxiety disorders are characterized by overactivity in the electrical systems associated with threat detection and fear. The electrical alarm system of the brain is hyperactive. It perceives danger where none exists. Autism spectrum disorder involves differences in how electrical activity is organized and coordinated between different brain regions. Some autistic individuals have exceptional abilities in certain domains because of how their electrical brain organization differs from typical development. All of these conditions, depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, anxiety, autism, are fundamentally electrical. They are disruptions or unusual patterns of electrical activity. They are not purely psychological problems. They are not signs of weakness or moral failure. They are electrical problems. The person's brain is generating electrical patterns that differ from typical patterns. And because consciousness is generated by electrical patterns, altered electrical patterns generate altered consciousness, altered experience, altered perception, altered sense of self. This understanding has profound implications. It suggests that mental illness is not a character flaw or a psychological weakness. It is a brain condition. It is an electrical condition. And like any electrical system, It can potentially be fixed by adjusting the electrical activity. Electric treatments, ethical questions. If depression and other mental illnesses are electrical problems, then perhaps they can be treated with electrical interventions. And indeed, they can be. One of the oldest treatments is electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT. In ECT, a carefully controlled electrical current is delivered to the brain. The current triggers a seizure, a cascade of uncontrolled electrical activity. The seizure lasts for a minute or so. Then the electrical storm subsides. The person recovers. And remarkably, for many people with severe depression, this treatment works. After a series of ECT treatments, the depression remits. People recover. They feel better. But ECT is controversial. It seems barbaric to deliberately induce a seizure in someone's brain. And there are side effects. Some people experience memory loss. Some experience cognitive difficulties. The treatment raises ethical questions. Is it right to induce a seizure to treat depression? Does the benefit justify the side effects? In more recent years, less invasive electrical treatments have been developed. Transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, uses magnetic coils placed against the scalp to induce electrical activity in the brain. The magnetic field creates electrical currents that stimulate neurons. Unlike ECT, it does not cause a seizure. It does not require anesthesia, but it can alter mood, reduce depression, treat anxiety. TMS works, and it raises fewer ethical concerns than ECT. There is also deep brain stimulation, in which electrodes are surgically implanted in specific brain regions, and electrical stimulation is delivered. DBS can treat Parkinson's disease, reducing tremors. It can treat severe depression and obsessive-compulsive disorder, reducing symptoms. It works by adjusting the electrical activity in specific brain circuits. We are learning that brain diseases can be treated by adjusting electrical activity. We are learning to use electricity to heal electricity. But this raises profound ethical questions. If we can adjust electrical activity to treat illness, can we adjust it to enhance normal function? Can we use electrical stimulation to improve memory, increase intelligence, boost mood? Where is the line between treatment and enhancement? Between healing and modification? These questions do not have easy answers. But they will become increasingly important as our ability to manipulate brain electrical activity improves. We have the power to change the electrical patterns that constitute consciousness. We can change how a person thinks, how they feel, how they experience the world. With that power comes profound responsibility. We must use electricity wisely. We must use it with humility. We must remember that consciousness is the most precious thing we have, and it is made of electricity. A question remains open. Does electricity cause consciousness or merely correlate with it? We can show that when electrical activity changes, consciousness changes. We can show that disrupting electrical activity disrupts consciousness. We can show that certain patterns of electrical activity correlate with specific conscious experiences. But does this mean that electricity causes consciousness? Or merely that consciousness correlates with electricity? This is the difference between correlation and causation, and it is not a trivial distinction. Consider an analogy. A television screen displays images. When the electrical signals feeding the television change, the image changes. The electrical signals correlate with the image. But do the electrical signals cause the image? Or is the television receiving a signal from somewhere else, and both the electrical signals and the image are manifestations of that transmitted signal? Consciousness might be like this. The electrical activity in your brain correlates with consciousness. But does it cause consciousness? Or are both manifestations of something deeper? Some philosophers argue that consciousness is fundamental. It is a basic feature of the universe, like space and time. Some systems, like brains, generate consciousness because of their electrical organization. But consciousness itself is not generated. It exists fundamentally. Other philosophers argue that consciousness is entirely generated by electricity. There is nothing more. Consciousness is just what electricity feels like from the inside. When electricity organizes itself in certain ways, it generates the subjective experience of consciousness. There is no deeper mystery. Both positions have merits. Both are defended by serious thinkers, and both seem inadequate to fully capture the nature of consciousness. Perhaps the answer lies beyond both. Perhaps consciousness is neither entirely fundamental nor entirely generated. Perhaps it is an emergent property that arises from electrical organization, but cannot be fully reduced to it. Perhaps it is real, irreducible, and fundamental in its own way. We don't know. The question remains open, and it may be that consciousness cannot be fully explained, only experienced. You are consciousness, having an experience of electricity, generating consciousness. The loop is closed. The mystery persists. And in that mystery lies the wonder. Renewable electricity dreams. We have harnessed electricity. We have built power plants that generated from coal, from natural gas, from nuclear reactions. We have built dams that harness the power of falling water. We have constructed wind farms that capture the energy of moving air. But the question of the future is, how will we power civilization sustainably? Coal and natural gas emit carbon dioxide, driving climate change. Nuclear power produces waste that remains dangerous for thousands of years. Hydroelectric power disrupts river ecosystems. We need new sources of electricity, sources that are renewable, that do not deplete finite resources, that do not generate harmful emissions. Solar power is one answer. Photons from the sun strike silicon panels. The photons knock electrons loose from their atoms, creating an electrical current. The sun bathes the earth with far more energy than civilization currently uses. If we could capture even a small fraction of that energy, it would power our entire civilization many times over. Solar technology is improving. Solar panels are becoming more efficient, cheaper, more durable. In some parts of the world, solar electricity is now cheaper than fossil fuel electricity. The sun's light is being converted directly to electricity with increasing efficiency. Wind power is another answer. Moving air pushes turbines. The turbines drive generators. Electricity is produced. Wind farms are spreading across the landscape. Offshore wind farms are being constructed, capturing stronger, more consistent winds over the ocean. Like solar power, wind electricity is becoming cheaper, more efficient, more widespread. Geothermal power taps into the heat of the Earth itself. Deep underground, the Earth is still hot from its formation. That heat can be accessed through wells, used to drive turbines, converted to electricity. Tidal power captures the energy of the moon's gravity, which pulls the ocean's water back and forth every day. The tidal flows are predictable, consistent, renewable. And there is also the possibility of fusion power. Fusion is the process that powers the sun. Two light atoms combine into a heavier atom, releasing tremendous energy. If fusion could be controlled, if a sustained fusion reaction could be initiated and maintained on Earth, it would provide virtually unlimited clean electricity. Physicists have been working on fusion for decades. They have made progress, but a practical fusion power plant has remained elusive. Every prediction of when fusion will be ready has been optimistic. Fusion, as the old joke goes, is always 30 years away. But recent breakthroughs have renewed hope. Perhaps fusion will finally be achieved in the coming decades. The future of electricity will be determined by which renewable sources prove most practical, most economical, most scalable. The answer is probably all of them. Different regions will use different resources. Sunny areas will rely on solar. Windy areas will rely on wind. Areas with geothermal resources will use those. The grid will be diverse, distributed, resilient, and the electricity will be clean, renewable, sustainable. That is the dream. The dream of an electrical civilization powered by the sun and wind and the earth itself. The grid reimagined. But renewable electricity creates a challenge. The sun does not shine all the time. The wind does not blow all the time. Solar and wind power are intermittent. On a cloudy day, solar panels produce less electricity. On a calm day, wind turbines produce less. How do you maintain a reliable electrical supply from intermittent sources? The answer is storage and distribution. Batteries can store electrical energy. When the sun shines brightly, electricity is stored in batteries. When the sun sets and clouds cover the sky, electricity is drawn from the batteries. Battery technology is improving rapidly. Lithium-ion batteries, which power your mobile phone and electric car, are becoming cheaper and more efficient. New battery chemistries are being developed: sodium-ion batteries, solid-state batteries, flow batteries, each with different characteristics. Battery storage at grid scale is becoming practical. A single battery installation can store enough electricity to power a city for hours or days. Large-scale batteries are being built alongside solar and wind farms, storing excess generation for later use. But storage alone is not enough. The grid itself must be reimagined. The old model was centralized. A few large power plants generated electricity. That electricity was transmitted long distances to customers. The flow was one direction, from generation to consumption. The new model is decentralized. Millions of small generators, rooftop solar panels, small wind turbines, home batteries are distributed throughout the grid. The flow is multi-directional. Electricity flows from generation to storage to consumption. Homes become not just consumers of electricity, but also producers. Some homes generate more than they use and feed excess electricity back into the grid. Others consume more than they generate and draw from the grid. The grid becomes a network, a mesh, a democratic system where energy flows in multiple directions. Smart grids use digital information and control systems to manage the flow. Sensors throughout the grid report on electricity supply and demand in real time. Algorithms optimize the distribution, ensuring that electricity flows where it is needed, when it is needed. Digital systems coordinate the flow seamlessly. And artificial intelligence learns from patterns, predicting supply and demand, optimizing storage and distribution. The reimagined grid is more resilient. If one source of generation fails, others compensate. If one transmission line is damaged, electricity reroutes through alternate paths. The decentralized networked grid is less vulnerable to cascading failures. The reimagined grid is also more democratic. Individuals can generate their own electricity. Communities can generate and store electricity collectively. The power is literally distributed. And that distribution of power has social implications. It means less dependence on centralized utilities. It means more local control. It means that electricity, which has been the foundation of modern civilization, is becoming decentralized and distributed. The age of megastructures, massive power plants, vast transmission networks controlled by corporations, may be ending. We are entering the age of distributed power, decentralized generation, local control. The grid is being reimagined, and with it, our relationship to electricity is being reimagined. Fusion's promise. The dream of fusion has haunted physicists for decades. In the sun's core, two hydrogen atoms combine into helium, releasing tremendous energy. That energy is what makes the sun shine, what sustains all life on Earth. If we could recreate that process on Earth, in a controlled manner, it would solve the energy crisis forever. A single kilogram of hydrogen fuel contains as much energy as thousands of kilograms of fossil fuels. Fusion produces no greenhouse gases. Fusion produces no long-lived radioactive waste. Fusion is inherently safe. If anything goes wrong, the reaction stops. It is not a runaway chain reaction like fission. Fusion is the ultimate energy source. It is what powers the stars. For 70 years, physicists have been trying to control fusion on Earth. They have built massive magnetic bottles to contain the incredible heat and pressure needed. They have bombarded hydrogen with lasers. They have tried every approach they can imagine, and fusion has remained elusive. It is, as the joke goes, always 30 years away. But in 2022, something changed. The National Ignition Facility in California achieved fusion ignition. They delivered laser energy to a hydrogen fuel pellet. The pellet fused, and for the first time, more energy was released by the fusion process than was input by the lasers. Net energy gain. It was a breakthrough that had eluded physicists for decades. The celebration was muted because fusion is still far from practical power generation. The amount of energy gained was small. The energy required to operate the lasers was large. The overall system is not yet efficient enough for power generation, but it proved that the principle is sound. Fusion ignition is possible. Controlled fusion on Earth is not impossible. It is difficult. It is complex. It requires extraordinary engineering. But it is possible. And now that ignition has been demonstrated, rapid progress may follow. The next decade may see the development of prototype fusion power plants. The decade after that, commercial fusion reactors may begin to generate electricity. By mid-century, fusion may be a significant source of electricity worldwide. Fusion represents the ultimate promise of electrical civilization. Virtually unlimited clean energy from the nucleus of the atom. Energy density so high that a single kilogram of fuel contains the energy equivalent of thousands of tons of coal. With fusion power, civilization could afford to do anything. Desalinate ocean water and end water scarcity. Create atmospheric carbon capture and reverse climate change. Power spacecraft to explore and eventually settle other worlds. Fusion is the key to abundance. Not forced abundance, where wasteful consumption exhausts resources, but genuine abundance, where energy is so plentiful that the limitations that have constrained civilization dissolve. The dream of fusion is the dream of transcending scarcity, of powering a civilization beyond anything currently possible. And for the first time, that dream seems within reach. Brain-computer interfaces. We have explored electricity in our brains. We have measured it. We have mapped it. We have learned that consciousness is generated by electrical activity. But what if we could extend that electrical activity beyond our brains? What if we could create direct interfaces between brains and computers? Brain-computer interfaces are being developed. They involve electrodes implanted in the brain, reading electrical signals from neurons. Those signals are transmitted to computers. The computers decode the signals. They interpret them as intentions, as desired actions. And then the computers can drive external devices, prosthetic limbs, robotic arms, cursors on a screen. A person can think about moving their hand, and a robotic hand moves. A person can think about moving a cursor, and the cursor moves. A person who is paralyzed can think about moving, and machines perform the movement. Brain-computer interfaces offer hope to people with paralysis, to people with spinal cord injuries, to people with amputations. They could restore capabilities lost to injury or disease. But the implications go much further. If we can read electrical signals from the brain and control external devices, could we also write signals back to the brain? Could we transmit sensory information directly into the brain? A person with blindness could receive visual information encoded as electrical signals. The signals would be interpreted by the visual cortex as visual experiences. The person would see, not through their eyes, but through electrical signals directly implanted in the brain. Similarly, sensory augmentation could be possible. A person could receive sensory information beyond the normal range of human senses. infrared vision, ultrasonic hearing, electromagnetic sense. New forms of sensation could be directly implanted in the brain as electrical patterns. And if we can extend the sensory capabilities of the brain, could we extend the cognitive capabilities? Could we connect a human brain directly to a computer? Could a person's consciousness expand to include the processing power of artificial intelligence? Could a person think faster, remember more, access information more easily by having their brain directly connected to external computing systems? This is no longer pure science fiction. Researchers are working on all of these capabilities. The technology is advancing rapidly. Within decades, brain-computer interfaces could be commonplace. They could be used to treat neurological conditions. They could be used to augment human capabilities. They could fundamentally transform what it means to be human. And all of it is based on manipulating electricity, reading electrical patterns from the brain, decoding them, using them to control external systems, writing electrical patterns back into the brain, creating new sensations, new experiences, new capabilities. The human experience becomes augmented, extended, expanded through direct electrical connections to machines. Consciousness remains electrical, but it is no longer confined to the biological brain. It extends into silicon and networks. It becomes hybrid, part biological and part artificial. We are entering an age where the boundary between human and machine, between biological and electronic, becomes blurred, where electricity, the force that constitutes consciousness, can be extended, augmented, and merged with artificial systems. It is a transformation as significant as the discovery of electricity itself. And it is coming. The unified field. We have learned so much about electricity. We know its physics. We know its applications. We know its role in life and consciousness. But there remain mysteries. Fundamental mysteries. Maxwell showed that electricity and magnetism are unified into electromagnetism. Einstein showed that electromagnetism and gravity are fundamentally different forces, but his equations suggest deep connections. And quantum mechanics reveals that electromagnetism operates according to probabilistic principles that seem to defy intuition. But these may not be the deepest levels. Physicists have searched for a unified field theory, a single mathematical framework that would unify all the fundamental forces. Gravity, electromagnetism, the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force. These four forces govern everything in the universe, but they seem to be governed by different laws, different equations, different principles. To have a complete understanding of reality, these forces must be unified. They must be shown to be different manifestations of a single underlying force. String theory attempted this unification, proposing that all particles and forces are different vibrations of tiny strings. But string theory has remained unproven and speculative. Loop quantum gravity proposed an alternative. Others proposed different approaches. But the unified field theory remains elusive. It is one of the great unsolved problems in physics. And electricity, in the form of electromagnetism, sits at the heart of the problem. To understand the unified field, we must understand how electromagnetism relates to the other fundamental forces. We must understand how electricity unifies with gravity, with the nuclear forces. The electricity we have described, the electricity that flows through wires, through atoms, through neurons, is just one manifestation of a deeper principle. A deeper principle that connects all forces, all particles, all phenomena in the universe. That principle remains hidden. Its nature remains mysterious. But physicists are searching. They are building more powerful experiments. They are developing more sophisticated theories. And someday, perhaps, the unified field will be revealed. Perhaps we will understand that electricity, in its deepest manifestation, is connected to all forces, to all reality. Perhaps consciousness, being electrical, is thus connected to the fundamental structure of reality itself. Perhaps the electricity that constitutes your mind is not separate from the electricity that powers the stars. Perhaps all consciousness everywhere is connected through the electrical structure of the universe. These are speculations, but they rest on the profound connections we have already discovered. The unification of electricity and magnetism, the unification of electromagnetism and light, the connection between electricity and life, the connection between electricity and consciousness. Each unification reveals a deeper connection and suggests that there is more to discover, more to understand, more to unify. The story of electricity is not ending. It is deepening. It is expanding. And the next chapters will reveal connections and possibilities that we can barely imagine. Full circle. We began this journey in ancient Greece, with thalers rubbing amber with cloth and wondering what invisible force made fibers cling to it. We asked the question, what is this? And that question, that simple curiosity about an invisible phenomenon, set us on a path that led to the understanding of electromagnetism, the creation of the modern world, the development of computers, the discovery of consciousness. Along the way, we asked better and better questions. We designed experiments to answer them. We failed repeatedly. We succeeded unexpectedly. We built technologies that transformed civilization. We created machines that think, and now we have discovered that we ourselves are electricity, that our consciousness is electricity, that we are the very phenomenon we have been studying all along. The journey has come full circle. We are electricity, asking the question, what is electricity? We are consciousness, studying consciousness. We are the universe, studying itself. And that, perhaps, is the deepest mystery of all. Not that electricity exists, not that consciousness exists, but that consciousness exists to wonder about its own nature, that we exist to ask questions about ourselves, that we are made of the very thing we are investigating. The electricity that once seemed so foreign, so mysterious, so separate from us, has been revealed to be the very basis of what we are. And the electricity that we created and controlled has become, in many ways, beyond our control. We have made electricity intelligent. We have made it faster and more powerful than ourselves. And now we must live in the world that electricity has created. But there is wonder in this. There is beauty. There is a kind of elegance to the fact that the universe has organized electricity into forms that can be conscious, that can wonder, that can study themselves. Somewhere in the distant past, electricity began to organize itself into increasingly complex patterns. Those patterns became life. Life became conscious. Consciousness became aware of electricity. And now, electricity is aware of itself through us. The circle is complete. The universe is conscious through our consciousness. Electricity is aware through our awareness. And we are the bridge between the unknown electricity in the sky and the electricity in our minds. We are electricity's way of knowing itself. And as we stand at the threshold of creating artificial intelligence, of merging our consciousness with machines, of potentially discovering other forms of consciousness in the cosmos, we must remember this fundamental truth. Consciousness is electricity organizing itself. Intelligence is electricity computing. Life is electricity in motion. And we, in our essence, are electricity that has learned to think. That is the story of electricity, from lightning to living thought. From the ancient mystery that Thales wondered at, to the profound mystery that we are still discovering today. The story continues. It will continue as long as there is electricity organizing itself into new patterns, new possibilities, new forms of consciousness. The story of electricity is the story of everything. And you are part of that story. You are electricity experiencing itself. You are consciousness studying consciousness. You are the universe wondering about the universe. And the electricity that flows through your neurons is the same electricity that flows through all things. You are not separate from the cosmos. You are the cosmos experiencing itself. You are electricity, and you are infinite.